We'll begin the public hearing, and I begin by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional lands, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are joining us today. I declare open the public hearing of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters for its inquiry into the 2022 federal election. And in accordance with the committee's resolution of the 2nd of August 2022, this hearing will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and the proof and official transcripts of proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I remind members of the media who may be present or listening on the web of the need to fairly and accurately report the proceedings of the committee. And I now call on Professor Beck and Professor Tham to give evidence, and we're just waiting for Dr. Lewis to join us in the room, but we might start while we're waiting for her. So for the Hansard record, could you state your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee, please?
My name is Luke Beck. I'm a Professor of Constitutional Law at Monash University, and I'm appearing in a personal capacity.
Thank you.
My name is Ju Cheong Tam. I'm a professor at the Law School at Melbourne University. I'm appearing in my personal capacity and as well as in my capacity as a board member of the Centre for Public Integrity.
Thank you both. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament, and therefore it has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Now, did either of you want to make a brief opening statement before we go to discussion and questions?
Luke, do you want to go first?
I thought we weren't making opening statements and going to rely on questions, but I would just very briefly, I would say on the question of political donations, I think we need to be clear about the limitations of the existing legal regime. What is required is disclosure of large donations, but there is no requirement for disclosure of political fundraising. And that distinction, I think, is a significant flaw in the system. And there are examples at state level that demonstrate how that can be fixed relatively easily. And it's a question for Parliament to finally get around to doing something about integrity at a federal level.
Okay, thank you. Well, we might move directly to questions. And Senator Waters, I will give you the floor first up, given you said you have to leave us shortly.
Thank you so much, Chair. I really appreciate that. And thanks so very much to the professors for joining us today and for your written submissions and, of course, for the work that you've done in this field over the years. Can I start, please, with Professor Beck? Regarding donations and spending caps in particular, you've referenced the Queensland model, and I'm from Queensland. Do you think that's a good model to adopt at the federal level? And how would you recommend that spending caps be calculated at the federal level, and when would they commence? Of course, we don't have fixed terms federally.
Yeah, so there's the Queensland's political donations and expenditure scheme is a very useful model to be considered for adapting to the federal level. And there's a few key features of the Queensland scheme. One is a quite broad definition of political fundraising, and as in what needs to be disclosed. Federally, it's just gifts, as in actual gifts with no quid pro quo. So tickets to fundraising dinners do not need to be disclosed. Sponsorship of gala dinners do not need to be disclosed, etc. And then, of course, the threshold for disclosure is extremely high. So, very little, a very small proportion of political fundraising is ever disclosed under the federal regime. In Queensland, they have a much lower disclosure threshold, and they have a much broader definition that effectively requires all forms of political fundraising to be disclosed. And the other element of the Queensland regime, which is, and these things exist in some of the other states as well, is a limitation on expenditure. So there's a limitation on how much political parties and candidates can spend on their political campaigns. And that effectively has sort of two key benefits. First, there's this idea about levelling the playing field so that smaller parties and independents, have some chance of a fair fight. But I suppose more importantly, in terms of integrity, it acts as an enhancement of those other political fundraising integrity measures. If there's a limit on what you can spend, then there's no need to spend all of your energies shaking down rich people for money and keeping their donations and other fundraising efforts from you secret, because you're not able to spend that money. And so that's expenditure caps exist in a number of states. The High Court has said that expenditure caps are perfectly valid constitutionally. And then obviously there's a tricky question of calculating what those caps are and when they should kick in. You don't want an unduly small expenditure cap, but nor do you want an unreasonably large expenditure cap. And you would have to do some, detailed analysis about the actual cost of, political campaigns in recent times, comparing that with state levels, etc., to come to a fair and reasonable number. But that is absolutely possible, and there are examples at state level that demonstrate mechanisms for how you calculate that initial cap, and then questions about raising it in line with inflation and so on.
Professor Beck, do you have a view on what the cap should be, and should it apply globally? Should it be seat by seat? But can you just elaborate on what you think might be a model that would remove the influence of big money and the pernicious influence that it can have on our democracy?
It's going to have to be a nuanced and multi-layered cap, because there's the expenditure that political parties spend in each seat for the seat-based campaigns. Then they have their global wider campaigns, their ads on national TV, ads in the metropolitan newspapers, etc., which aren't necessarily part and parcel of a seat-based campaign. And of course, there's a difference between a seat-based campaign in connection with a major party or a minor party such as yours, and a seat-based campaign for an independent who has no broader network or party. So, but those things exist at state level, where there are seat-based caps, caps for where there's connections to parties, caps where it's a different cap where you're not connected to a party because you don't get the benefit of that broader global advertising, etc. So all of these problems, or theoretical problems that people might like to raise, are not really practical problems in reality, because we can see this at work perfectly functionally at the state level, and state campaigns are robustly contested, and we can see it working in practice.
Okay, yes, I certainly agree that we can and should surmount those perceived difficulties. Have you had the opportunity to form a view on what you think should be the best model of how a federal spending cap could work?
I think some kind of adaptation of the Queensland and New South Wales models are probably the best mechanism. Professor Tam, I think, has a more detailed understanding of the mechanisms for calculating the caps than I do. So perhaps he may be able to give you a more detailed answer on that.
Yes, please. Professor Tam, over to you. If you can elaborate on your proposal or your suggestion for a best practice spending cap that would ideally, in my view, remove the influence of big money from politics.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Senator Waters, and thanks to the committee for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. Let me pick out a number of questions that you made, Senator Waters. I think at a federal level, of course, one aspect of the electoral system to be grappled with is the fact that there's no fixed terms. So I think in terms of how the cap operates, and the submission by the Centre for Public Integrity makes this argument, and as does, I think, the submission by the Human Rights Legal Centre, is to basically date the operation of the caps from the previous election. So I think it was 20 months, I think the Centre for Public Integrity submission makes. As to the level of cap, I mean, my strong view is that I think it's not so much the specific amount that we should be trying to fix, but the principles and the processes for determining the level. And as to the principles, let me identify three. One of which is highlighted in the Centre for Public Integrity submission. So I think having the level of the cap applying to parties based on the number of candidates they're fielding. And this is aspects found in the Queensland scheme, and New South Wales scheme, and in the UK scheme, and so on and so forth. And the other two principles, which are more vague, but I think just got to be given flesh in terms of the process. I think, and Luke mentioned this, I think there are two broad rationales for spending caps. One is the level playing field, or the fairness rationale. The other one is really an anti-corruption rationale, because the demand for spending drives the supply of funds. So the specific aspect of that rationale is really trying to prevent what's called the arms race, yeah, because of course elections are competitive processes, as they should be. Now, those are the principles, and what I've advocated, separately, is that what should happen is really a process of giving flesh to these principles, perhaps in the first instance through a committee like this, and then subject to regular periodic review, independent review. And that independent review could be by the Australian Electoral Commission in also basically testing whether the level that's been set is suitable in terms of giving effect to these particular principles.
Can I ask whether you think it's necessary to do, if your objective was to remove the influence of big money from politics, which is certainly the Greens' objective, do you need both spending caps and donations reform, or does one suffice? What's your view on whether actually a mixture of the two could perhaps be the most advantageous?
I think I think you need both, and because big money in politics basically has that undue influence at two different stages. So with the spending caps, what spending caps deals with is what the High Court has characterized as war chest corruption. And what they simply mean there is the fact that you've had huge amounts of money that allow the distortion of electoral outcomes. Yeah. Whereas with the caps on political donations, what you're trying to deal with is the influence of big money in terms of the policy process. Yeah. So, in terms of paid lobbying and so on and so forth. So I think you need both because you're dealing with two aspects of a broader problem.
Thank you. That's the most succinct explanation of the answer to that question that I've heard. I appreciate that, Professor Tam. Now, can we just harken back quickly to spending caps? Do either of you have a view on what expenditure should be included in the cap? Should it be a cap on all expenditure completely? Should it just be for advertising, as some other proponents have contended? Should it include staff, venue hire, polling, consultants? To what do you think the spending cap should apply for the best democratic outcome?
Do you want to go, or I'm happy to?
So I suppose there are different views on that, because if you have a limit on just advertising, whether that's billboards, newspapers, radio, TV, etc. If you have an enormous war chest that allows you to do, 10 times the market research and advertising, marketing for expenditure, then it's not a level playing field in terms of whatever your cap is on, television ads, etc. So caps are important, absolutely, and you might want to cap that at particular amounts or at a particular kind of expenditure, or get a more complete cap on anything to do with the election, which is, but you'd have to define that. But you also need disclosure of what you spend, so that all of that can be seen. One of the best responses to integrity risks is daylight, and disclosure is important. Disclosure of revenue, all fundraising, and disclosure of political expenditure in those categories, not necessarily itemized to the 10-cent mark, but how much money was spent on television advertising, how much money was spent on consulting firms, how much money was spent on marketing focus groups, etc. It's a combination of mechanisms. There's no one silver bullet that improves integrity, that creates a level playing field. It's a combination of those things working collectively that makes a meaningful difference. There will still be instances of wrongdoing, as there always is in any context, but it will change the culture.
Sorry to interrupt. Can I just interrupt there? I believe we now have Dr. Lewis on the phone. Dr. Lewis, are you there?
Yes, I am. And look, I'm sorry, I was told the Victorian Parliament, and I've been to 4 buildings looking for the committee, only to find out it's in Canberra. But my email definitely said the Victorian Parliament.
Yeah, well, that's a very unfortunate mix-up. I'm glad you're on the phone. For the hands, can I get you to state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee today for the Hansard record, please?
Yes, certainly. Dr. Colleen Lewis, and I'm an honorary professor with the Australian Studies Institute at the ANU.
Excellent, thank you. Senator Waters, can I say one more question for you, and then we'll need to move on because other members will have questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Chair. I was just about to seek your guidance on that because, of course, I've got far more questions than I have time, so I'll pop some on notice just to let the witnesses know. Can we go to truth in advertising law? Because I think each of you, including Dr. Lewis, and welcome Dr. Lewis, have opined on that. You've talked about, I think it's you, Professor Beck, you've said that both the South Australian and ACT models obviously exist and have their benefits. The AEC has expressed that it doesn't wish to be the regulator if there were to be truth in advertising laws. So can I ask, what organisation do you think should be in charge? And can you talk a little bit more about the scope of truth in advertising laws you think would be appropriate and advantageous at the federal level?
Yeah, so the South Australian model has been in existence for decades and it works. You'll see in my submission that I quote the South Australian Electoral Commissioner, who's the regulator, saying that perhaps its most important effect is changing the culture. So it's not about punishing or fining parties or individuals for wrongdoing. It's about changing the culture. And I think this label of truth in political advertising is a little bit problematic. It's not really about truth per se. It's really the best way to think about it, I think, is about extending our existing deceptive and misleading advertising rules to the political context. There's really no good reason why politicians and other political actors should be exempt effectively from deceptive and misleading advertising laws. And these laws don't, in South Australia and elsewhere, prevent politicians and other actors, expressing contested opinions about things which are not, objectively true or false. It's not about opinions. It's about, purported statements of facts. That's what it's about. It's quite narrow. It's quite limited, but it does work. You don't get the lies. You don't get the misinformation, but you still get robust, contested elections. South Australia is a very functioning democracy, as I'm sure all of us here know. So that's a very modest way to have things work. There are variations and other models that can be considered, but if we're doing this, as a first step, I think the South Australian model is a really good way to proceed. In terms of the regulator, I suppose there's two responses to that. Firstly, it's not really up to the Australian Electoral Commission whether or not they're the regulator. It's up to Parliament whether or not they're the regulator. All public service bodies are obliged to follow their governing statutes, and so whatever Parliament decides will be the outcome. In South Australia, in the ACT, the regulatory body is the Electoral Commission, and that works. I don't think in South Australia, the ACT their laws are very new, so there's not much experience to speak about. But in South Australia, it's been operating for a while. I don't know that there's any lack of trust or view that the Electoral Commission there is politicised. But if that's problematic, the other possible regulator would obviously be the ACCC, which has mandate to deal with other deceptive, misleading advertising laws in the commercial advertising context, etc. So, they're possibly the ones with the existing skill base to take this on and wouldn't have to create a new sort of capability and capacity, which, in fairness, the AEC does not have that existing, skill base and capability to do. So there's questions about, perceptions of being partisan, political, but also a more practical consideration that they don't have the experience and skill set and people yet to deal with it. Whereas if the ACCC were to take this on, it's really just a very modest expansion of their existing remit for existing deceptive and misleading advertising laws. So I think that would also be a workable regulator. I don't have a strong view either way as which is the most appropriate regulator. I personally don't think it particularly matters which is the regulator. So whichever is sort of particularly the best way to running would work for me, but South Australia and the ACT have chosen to go with the electoral commissions.
Dr. Lewis, did you want to add anything to that before I pass the call over?
Yes, please. You would see from my submission that my concern about truth in advertising is the idea of that there is hypocrisy here where one small element is excluded and everybody else is obliged to be truthful when they're advertising. And I think the Mediscare campaign in a couple of elections ago and then the tax scare in the more recent election really do nothing for the trust that people have in the political process. So I think you'll see from mine, I haven't drilled down into the minute thing here. My submissions are about the absolute need to restore trust in the political process and a call for JSCAM to actually do something about reforming political donations laws and truth in advertising through their recommendations, very strong recommendations. I can understand why the AEC may not wish to take up this task, because I think they're going to have to need a lot of funding if they are to do it. And I think it's incumbent on the Parliament, if it decides the appropriate body is the AEC, then it's incumbent on the Parliament to make sure they're adequately funded. And again, I actually mentioned the AEC in my submission. Yes, I can understand why you would say the ACCC has the ability already. In fact, they've already got a case going against a couple of businesses at the moment for not being truthful in their advertising. So my strong push really is that it is absolutely essential that we have truth in advertising. Otherwise, the gap, the trust deficit between the politicians and those who elect them to power is only going to widen. And, you know, we've had from the Prime Minister recently saying that he wants to do politics differently. Well, in my opinion, this is a very good starting point, along with drastic reform of political donations, is the next step after the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Thank you.
Senator
you.
Waters, can I make a few
Thanks, everyone.
I think this is an important issue. I think we are facing, Australian democracy as well as democracies across the world are facing this issue in terms of degraded political information environment. They're coming from various directions. But I think we should hasten cautiously, I think, when we think about this truth in political advertising legislation in terms of the agency responsible. I think the substance of the reform that Luke suggests and others suggest, I endorse. I would say a few points. I think in this country, electoral commissions in this country are amongst the most well-respected in the world. And one of the reasons they're one of the most well-respected in the world, in terms of their professionalism, but because of their impartiality, both real and perceived. And I think when we entrust new powers that perhaps involve them in functions that might run the risk of politicization, I think we should take those very seriously, because once a reputation for impartiality is lost, a very hard-won reputation for impartiality is lost, it's very hard to get back. The other last point I make is simply this. I think the truth in political advertising legislation operates in a ex post facto way. Yeah. So you make a statement that is purportedly to be false, and then there's basically an enforcement proceedings and so on and so forth. I would encourage the committee to think about ex ante measures. And what I mean by this is really about, having political parties and candidates having a certain code to ensure the veracity of the statements they make. And you might have, for example, before a political ad goes up, the party secretary has to sign off and said, I'm satisfied to the best of my endeavors that this statement is true. Yeah. And they need to have processes to back that up. And if they deviate from that process, you could actually have a certain set of consequences, including deduction of public funding. That I think actually the Australian Electoral Commission quite easily police, because what you're policing is not whether the statement is true or false, but whether political parties or candidates have followed a very specified procedures.
Can I just respond very quickly to that? Would that be appropriate?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes, thank you. Look, I can understand the argument and I respect the opinions that have been given, but I think hastening cautiously is what we've actually been doing for decades. And, I have a certain frustration about the lack of any movement in the political donations, truth in advertising area. And I think I definitely take the point about after the fact, if somebody has been not as truthful as they should have been. But the one way to sort of get a preventive element into this is to make sure the fine is substantial. And once that fine is substantial, and if anybody breaches, say the code even, then it will then act as a preventive tool for the next person that may be thinking about it. So, I'm sort of a little bit ambivalent about taking too much time. There is that many submissions on political donations and that many submissions on truth in advertising that I think all the expert opinion is there, and it's the expert opinion is not divided really on these issues. So, again, I'm really urging the committee to move this issue forward, and certainly well before the next federal election. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. It's certainly something there's been a lot of evidence put to the committee about, so we'll continue to go through that. Senator McGrath, did you have questions?
I think I was going to let Senator Cadell start and then come back to me if possible, please.
Rightio. Okay, we'll start with Senator Cadell then.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to go to enfranchisement of foreign nationals to vote in Australia, if we may. Do you believe generally, that enfranchising non-Australians to vote in the Australian elections was envisaged by the Constitution of Australia?
Well, I'm not sure that the Constitution, a written document, envisages, anything. But the question, I suppose, the question you're really getting at is whether that would be sort of within the Constitution, within the requirements of the Constitution. And that's a tricky question. So the Constitution requires that Parliament be directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth and for the Senate, the people of the states. But the Constitution doesn't really tell us who or what the people are. Now, very plainly, Australian citizens are part of the people and Australian citizens can vote. There's then a question of whether or not the people is a broader concept than just citizens, and how far that might extend, and does that include long-term permanent residents, etc. There is certainly, so that's a legal question where there are question marks and an expansion of the franchise to include non-citizens, although we do have experience of British subjects who are here before a particular date being able to vote. So
That's pre-1984? Yep.
Exactly. But how much further that might go, there are question marks about that. Now, the fact that there's a question mark doesn't necessarily mean you shouldn't do it, but it might suggest that it's worthwhile thinking about, are there other ways of doing it? So if we have the situation where there are people who are permanent residents, but not citizens, and for example, your terms of reference talk about New Zealanders, the mechanism for New Zealanders to become Australian citizen is quite complex and expensive in some cases, and so it's actually very difficult for these people to become citizens. And if we made it easier for these people to become citizens, then that's a very simple pathway forward. If you're an Australian citizen, not only can you vote, you must vote. But so if there is a desire to expand the franchise, then really I think what you may be getting at is making it easier for these people to become Australian citizens. Yep. But there are sometimes good reasons why people don't want to become citizens, and nevertheless they have a stake in Australian democracy, and other countries allow non-citizens who meet certain criteria and who have a stake in those democracies to vote as well. So that would lead to, I think, inevitably a constitutional challenge. Whether that would succeed, I don't know. But a constitutionally very safe pathway forward, make the pathway to citizenship easier. Yep. A more interesting pathway forward would be to expand the franchise to include, a subset of permanent residents, for example.
I think it's a really important question that you asked, Senator. I'll make 3 points. One is that the Commonwealth doesn't even mention citizenship. So citizenship as a concept, in fact, actually emerged in terms of the legal landscape really around the 1980s. What the Commonwealth Constitution refers to, as Luke correctly pointed out, is that the House of Representatives and the Senate shall be directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth. So I think it's that phrase that we must focus our mind on. Who are the people of the Commonwealth? Now, what is clear is that the people of the Commonwealth permits the enfranchisement of non-citizens as we understand it now. And in my submission, in fact, and this is forgotten, the original Commonwealth Franchise Bill, in fact, was a very very broad-based bill. I mean, we often remember it because of its racist exclusions. But the original bill, in the words of Senator Richard O'Connor, the New South Wales senator had carried the bill, said, in his words, had one ground only as giving a right to vote, and that is residence in the Commonwealth for 6 months or over by any person of adult age. Yeah. So it doesn't mention citizenship. It doesn't even mention British subjects. At that time, of course, Australia was under the Empire. It was about residence. And the third point I make is this. If you look at Section 24, which is about the House of Representatives being directly chosen by the people of the Commonwealth, it sets up a system for determining how do you count the people of the Commonwealth. And what it refers to in the second paragraph of Section 24 of the Constitution are the latest statistics of the Commonwealth. My submission goes in a bit of detail about this, but if you look at the ABS, and when we talk about how many people are there in Australia, 25 million and so on and so forth, again, the concept is not citizenship, it's about length of residence, or length of usual residence more accurately. And that's why my submission, what it advocates in terms of the enfranchisement of permanent residents and long-term holders of temporary visas is based on the idea that people of the Commonwealth, the membership of the Commonwealth, should, yes, citizenship should entitle you to the right to vote, membership, but what we should be basing it upon is this idea of social membership based on the connections and the belonging you have to this country.
If I can follow up. Professor, I've gone through a lot of the countries where you can vote in different ways, and South Korea doesn't have compulsory voting, which I think is a fundamental difference than we have here. You can, after 3 years, foreign nationals who have lived in South Korea, but the only one that has compulsory voting with foreign eligibility that I can see non-discriminatory seems to be Uruguay, and they have to be 15 years there. Are you aware of any others that compulsory voting that there's freedom of voting?
Senator, you're quite right. I think what you're saying is quite right. I mean, if the committee recommends and this country decides to enfranchise permanent residents and long-term holders of temporary visas, it will be not a follower, it will be a leader. Yeah. And I think this is not a problem, it's an opportunity. I mean, this country has pioneered various democratic innovations. I mean, it was known at the turn of the 20th century as really the democratic leader in terms of enfranchisement of women and so on and so forth. And I think this is an opportunity here. I mean, in my submission, I've pointed to various international documents that give support to my argument, but you're quite right. I mean, I can't point that there's no worldwide trend about enfranchising permanent residents and long-term holders of temporary visas. I'm not going to make that argument.
And I think where Professor Beck's point go of making a pathway to citizenship to incorporate specifically, I think New Zealand is in this, is a more non-discriminatory way of allowing voting. Because I take the point in the Australian Citizenship Pledge, and I take away the first line for believers and non-believers. I pledge my loyalty to Australia and its people, whose democratic beliefs I share, whose rights and liberties I respect, whose laws I will uphold and obey. When you go to a worldwide non-discriminatory thing, there are countries that may not, foreign actors that may not be that friendly to Australia. I think having a pledge where that is said about our democracy is very important. So that's just my point on that little thing. Has the High Court, in any of its judgments, made any indication how they feel about non-citizens voting?
They, again, and this is detailed in my submission. I mean, you do have dicta by Chief Justice Gleeson in the Roach case that says that citizenship could be a basis for the denial of the right to vote in the federal elections. And the point I make there is simply that dicta, and that's probably the only main dicta I can find in terms of the point that you raised, Senator, is that like what Chief Justice Gleeson is saying in terms expressly is that while lack of citizenship could provide a substantial reason for exclusion, it does not say, which is what is reflected in the Commonwealth Electoral Act right now, that it must result in a denial of the right to vote.
And last point.
And of course, the High Court recognises that there are people in this country who are not citizens, but who are nevertheless not aliens, and therefore, for example, can't be deported if they commit crimes. There are a small number of Indigenous people, for example, who, for curious reasons, end up not being Australian citizens, and they are not aliens. They are not liable to deportation, even if they are a dual citizen, for example. So there are these indirect constitutional bases for thinking that it might be constitutionally valid to expand the franchise beyond citizens. But how far there are question marks over that. So simply being a citizen is not necessarily the be all and end all of what it is to be an Australian. We saw that in the Love case about those non-citizen Indigenous.
How do you think Section
I
44's
would add-
strict interpretation applies to that as a citizen?
Can you repeat that question?
How do you think the
Senator?
High Court's interpretation of Section 44 cases and the right to do things applies to declarations and voting and a citizen's role?
Section 44 is not about the right to vote. Section
No,
44 is about the whole
representation.
office.
Yep.
I
Okay.
quite understand. Yeah, I mean, we're not talking about, and the thing is that as we know from the whole series of Section 44 controversies, that one can have the right to vote, but not necessarily have the right to stand for office, right? Before Section 44 kicks in. So I accept that. So we might extend the right to vote to the groups that I argue for, but doesn't mean they necessarily have the ability to stand for office under Section 44. What I would point out to Senator, that two things. One, from a constitutional aspect, that the High Court in New South Wales, number one, struck down the New South Wales ban on political contributions from foreigners. And in doing so, it recognized that foreigners are entitled to actually influence the political process. Now, I'm not saying that entails a right to vote. They did not say that. But they're basically recognizing they have the fact that you have a very specific ban, in their words, a discriminatory ban against foreigners, that was constitutionally invalid. The other point I'll make is that at our local government level, and again, this is detailed in my submission, it is residents. It is residents that actually entitles, in most jurisdictions, that entitles a person to vote, not citizenship.
But local government isn't subject to the Constitution, fundamental difference. It's not recognised in the Constitution.
That's true, but this cannot be determined. The constitutional context is important, but the Constitution actually, in many cases, is permissive, right? So ultimately, it's going to be a question for Parliament, for senators and your colleagues to determine whether it is in the best interest. So the Constitution provides the mix, but it's not going to lead us to a particular answer.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll
I might
just
take
make a
us
quick
back
comment
now
if I
to
may.
truth in
Sorry,
political
it's awful,
advertising,
I can't
actually.
see anybody, so. Look, I'm not a
Oh, sorry.
constitutional lawyer,
But Dr. Lewis.
so I bow to the superior knowledge of my colleagues on this. I'm a political scientist, and the biggest hurdle that may come in any change is convincing the Australian electorate that this change is what they want. And so even if the Parliament decides they'd like to move this issue forward, they're going to have to find a way in which to do it so that you're not getting a backlash from many Australians who may consider that citizenship is fundamental to the ability to vote. Now, there's lots of arguments why this may not be necessarily the case, but the important point is you've got to convince the Australian electorate of that. And so I guess I'll leave my only comment about that because, as I said, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I did constitutional law as a subject years ago, and I've forgotten practically all I've learned. So on that thing, I'll bow out. But I don't think we can take the politics out of this in arriving at a decision.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I'm going to move us back to truth in political advertising. And Professor Beck, you make the point around how we have a very we already have an understanding of the definition of misleading or deceptive conduct in advertising, but we haven't applied that to electoral advertising. So can you explain to us how you would see that applied and whether that definition carries over from a commercial application to electoral matters?
Well, I suppose it's true that the current Australian consumer law provisions don't apply to political advertising. That's right, but we see that effectively in practice in the South Australian and ACT models, and the commercial deceptive misleading advertising rules apply to a variety of all sorts of bizarre different contexts. You've got the pharmaceutical industry, you've got the confectionery industry, you've got the car manufacturing industry. Those definitions apply across the board. And so if a politician starts talking about, I'll make something up, the Purple Party has a policy, to kill all blue-eyed babies. I mean, you can apply deceptive misleading advertising rules to that statement just as easily as you can to, the dodgy statements that some pharmaceutical companies make about their headache tablets. It's, a perfectly understandable, well-established concept in Australian law and law elsewhere. So I don't think anybody doubts that those kinds of things can be applied. And it's important to note that in the South Australian ACT model, the proposal that I've got in my submission, it's about purported statements of fact. So if you express an opinion, my opponent's policies will, be terrible for the country and you shouldn't vote for them, or, will be terrible for the economy or whatever, that's an expression of opinion to which these rules wouldn't apply. But if you were to make a statement that purports to be a statement of fact, my opponent has a particular policy X, that is what you apply the deceptive misleading advertising rules to, not to statements of opinion. So it's only to those purported statements of fact that you would apply these rules to. All of the frills and the bells and whistles about opinions, etc. You guys can continue to do your thing, but you can't lie about your opponents or lie about your own policies, etc., or lie about the broader sort of context in which the Australian election is being conducted. It's quite a narrow set of the ACT and South Australian rules. What I've proposed is really quite narrow. It's only about those points of fact. I don't think anybody seriously argues that it's unworkable. It's a question of whether there's the political will to do it. There's interesting questions about best enforcement mechanisms and should there be fines or takedown orders, etc. But the ability to apply the concepts to the conduct, I don't think anybody doubts that that's possible.
Thank you. So taking, if we decide that political will is there, and noting that a lot of submitters have put to us the South Australian model, with all due respect to my South Australian colleagues, Senator Grogan, Mr Stevens, my observation is that in South Australia there are very genteel, lovely people, and perhaps at a federal level we play our politics a little bit harder. Have you thought, and I'll throw this open to all of you, about how we avoid a model that's weaponised by political actors?
Oh dear. Gosh, I could just say good luck. Because look, everything ends up being weaponised, which is really, it's a pity. That's one of the problems we've got with the National Anti-Corruption Commissions around Australia. But look, I just make the point that when it comes to whether something is truthful or not, it is up to members of Parliament to set the standards, I would have thought, for everybody else. And there are some times when it is just blatantly untrue. And I think the two issues I referred to earlier about the Mediscare and the death penalty taxes and all that were just clearly at any level untrue, and were said purely in the hope of being able to gain political power. So I wouldn't like to be drafting the legislation, but perhaps in a code of conduct, this might assist, especially if the code of conduct, I've just gone down.
I think it's also important to recognise that such a law wouldn't exist in a policy vacuum. For example, there are already provisions in the Commonwealth Criminal Code about making false statements to Commonwealth agencies. So if you, for example, Chair, were to make a false report about your opponent, you may find yourself in a lot of hot water, whether that's a false report about deceptive, misleading advertising, or a false report about political donations disclosure, or a false report about a bank robbery. So effectively, we have this broader context of making false and vexatious complaints to government agencies already. So we have to understand these proposals in that broader context. Of course, politicians will try and weaponize things against their opponents. You do it already in other contexts already, and I think one of the important things with these kinds of reforms is to change the culture, because the culture is not ideal. And perhaps you might want to take a leaf out of your South Australian colleagues' book. And the South Australian Electoral Commissioner, as I mentioned before, mentions that one of the impacts of the law in South Australia is not that he runs around enforcing it all the time, that it's had a cultural change whereby the major political players tend to just comply with the rules. And so there's no need for enforcement action. And if you have politicians, making false reports, there may well be legal consequences for that under existing laws, and they look dodgy, and so that may actually have disadvantageous political consequences as well.
So we're looking at laws that also drive behaviour change rather than just regulate, is what you're saying?
Yes, I think that's the principal purpose of these laws. It's to drive behaviour change. We don't want to we want to stop the misinformation and the disinformation. You don't want to deal with it after the fact. You want to prevent it, and this is one mechanism for doing it. It's not going to be a silver bullet, but it is one mechanism to drive behaviour change.
On that point around misinformation and disinformation, should the committee be considering communications outside of paid advertising? Are there issues that we need to think about more broadly beyond that space? I'm thinking here in terms of social media and the misinformation and disinformation campaigns there that aren't paid for.
Well, we already have that. For example, the rules that require the authorization statement, authorized by so and so of such and such a party. Those statements aren't just required to be put on paid advertising. Those are required to be placed on all kinds of electoral matters. So when you post things on your Facebook or TikTok or Twitter accounts, you have to carry those authorization messages as well. And my view is that these deceptive, misleading advertising laws should apply to that just as much as a paid ad in the newspaper or a billboard or an ad on radio. There's no reason why these rules should apply differently, whether or not you've paid for the ad or just posted it on your TikTok at no expense to yourself.
Can I add to
that comment by Luke?
sorry, I'll let Colleen go first.
Oh, sorry. I do apologise. I can't see what's going on. It's very difficult. Thank you. I agree that Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, really, that's probably the principal way in which people communicate these days. So, and it seems it's a little bit sad, isn't it, that we're having a discussion talking about our elected representatives telling the truth. And I think the cultural change that Luke referred to is absolutely crucial. And we've taken one small step towards that with the introduction of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. And I see, and I've said in my submission, that the next step forward is a reform of political donations and truth in advertising. And I think if we can start stepping forward in this direction, we will get the cultural change, which is absolutely crucial. And I keep on coming back to that trust deficit. But, democracy is a pretty fragile thing. And we need to do everything in our power to protect that political system. Thank you.
Can I just briefly add? I think the chair raised the issue in terms of the digital campaigning space, social media, and what's relevant to this committee. I think misinformation, disinformation is clearly salient aspects of that problem, but I would encourage a broader view. I've just completed with various other colleagues a report on digital campaigning and political finance, And it's not just this misinformation, disinformation that are salient problems, but it's really about manipulation. And that manipulation actually occurs in a structural way through the digital architecture in terms of the social media platforms, but also importantly and more directly in terms of the terms of this committee is what we term accumulated digital assets. So what we're referring to here, for example, voter analytics, yeah, okay, so data points collected on voters, whether it be through on-the-ground campaigning or through, basically garnering data points from their social media use and internet. And we saw this, I think, put to great effect in the Cambridge Analytica actions with Brexit. It's one of the known unknowns, I suppose, in Australian elections. We don't actually know how much that's being used right now. And it does raise real important questions in terms of Australian democracy.
Okay, thank you all. Senator McGrath, I'll throw to you now.
Cheers, thank you. I can refer to my own party in Queensland, where we are operating at a state level under the regime that you've praised. And it's just interesting that, for example, that I think there is 3 times as many staff in the compliance and accountancy team in headquarters than there are in the campaign team. So do you think if there was to be greater regulation of the disclosure regime at a federal level, do you think there should be greater resourcing for political parties who essentially are volunteer organisations, apart from a small headquarters, and I think that's for all parties. Do you think there should be greater resourcing for those political parties to assist them in operating under the regime that you propose?
I think the answer I'll give, Senator, is an emphatic yes. And that's clear in terms of New South Wales reforms, where there were increase in public funding, and one of the central reasons was to ensure there were enough staffing resources in terms of compliance. The other point I'll make is I think it is clear. I see if there's going to be a increased regulation, of course, going to be increased compliance activity. And I think we should be conscious that this regulation doesn't amount to an informal barrier of entry to smaller parties or newcomers. And I think the resourcing of those small parties and newcomers, whether directly through public funding or through the Electoral Commission, basically, and enabling them to actually comply, I think is an important aspect in terms of putting forth this reform in an effective and equitable way.
Yeah, absolutely. Integrity is important, and integrity, carries with it compliance costs, and that needs to be factored into this decision making. But those compliance costs should not be seen as a reason to not proceed. Politics at state level in those states where these regimes exist functions, perfectly healthily. So, the time for looking for excuses to delay at a federal level, I think, really needs to come to an end. And of course, as well as providing additional public support, potentially political parties and independent candidates, there's a lot to be said for providing appropriate resourcing to the Electoral Commission to develop systems to make reporting easier. You can have really clunky reporting forms, or you can have really intuitive, easy to use reporting forms that makes life easier for large political parties as well as for small, solo individual independent candidates, and making sure there's appropriate funding for that kind of resourcing development at the AEC level to make sure that their online reporting and accounting forms are really high quality is important. And I think there should be quite a bit of investment in that. And I think that probably goes for disclosure of political donations, and I hope disclosure of political revenue more broadly to make it easy to comply. You can have principles and rules, and you can make them easier or harder to comply with based on the bureaucratic paperwork that has to go on. That can be designed well, or it can be designed poorly.
And this is sorry, Dr. Lewis.
Yeah, look, I've said in my submission that I would support an increase in public funding on the condition that all the other reforms that are necessary in the political donations regime actually happened. I think that if we're going to give more money to political parties in any way, they have to come to the party with the other reforms that we so desperately need. And also the other thing, I know I keep on coming back to, but as a political scientist, it's what I do, you're going to have to convince taxpayers that there is a benefit in giving more money, more of their money to political parties to, run political campaigns, etc. And I think with the trust deficit where it is, that's going to be a very difficult argument to win, although I do point out that you have many, many experts who have argued that they would support an increase in political funding with other conditions. And I think that the committee could look at the people who are supporting that and might be able to use their expertise in that area to mount the argument to the Australian people on why it could well be in the public interest to have a modest increase to political parties. But then you've got to remember how many people belong to political parties in Australia, and how would the rest of the population feel about the fact that they don't want to join them. So, you've got all these issues to do with on a political level.
Dr. Lewis, I suppose one question to you, and maybe to the others also, is that you mentioned about people not joining political parties, and I'm on the record for this, is that I think political parties are unfairly treated by the media and some thought leaders, in that it has become perfectly acceptable to join political movements who might be chasing a certain issue, but those people who join, the Labor Party or the Greens or the Liberals or the Nationals are seen as lesser operators in civic society. And I think of my own party in Queensland, it is full of thousands of volunteers who don't join the party for personal enrichment. They join the party because they want to, get my mob elected, and they have a common set of beliefs. And one of my fears is, and I speak to someone who probably spends too much time at branch meetings, is the worst job in any political party at a branch level has been the treasurer, because of it's just so hard. And I go to one of the other contributions, it's just so hard for normal people to deal with the paperwork that is expected to be complied with by the regulatory bodies. So I would welcome your comments and your counsel about how you make it easier for people to join and participate in the political process and not have these barriers put up because you have regulatory bodies who just put all this red tape on top of their involvement.
I think it's important.
Senator McGrath, I think you'd have to ask why people aren't joining political parties, and it won't be the paperwork that's preventing them from doing so. I take your point about political movement, but these are usually people who are very concerned just about a single issue, so they're not seeing the broader picture. But I really think political parties need to have a good look at how they're conducting themselves, and I would suggest, and I've written about this publicly, but if you're going to have a reviews of political parties, why are they always done by members of the political party? Sure, senior members, very respected members, but we don't do that if we want to look at other issues. We get independent people to come in and have a look, but political parties very rarely even ask people who are independent. Where are the devil advocates, the genuine devil advocates, when you're looking about why people won't join political parties anymore? Why people are saying things that they shouldn't be saying across the board about our members of parliament. And I think you need to go back in steps there to look at what is the problem. And I understand about your concern about the red tape and compliance, but do you know that all red tape usually comes from, which I would suggest most red tape comes from, the fact that somebody's done something wrong. So we put in another law to fix it up. So if they didn't do anything wrong, we wouldn't have all these laws that are can sometimes, making you think you can't come up for air. So I think to answer your question, you need to go back a few steps and look at the actual foundation of what the problem is.
Supporting off Dr. Lewis's final point there, yes, there may be a lot of effort and energy that goes into compliance, but of course there's that amount of energy is put into raising all these political donations and other sources of political revenue for their expenditure and then expending them. So there are people within political parties who go to all that energy to raise the money, budget it, expend it, but there seems to be a reluctance to want to reveal that publicly. If you can raise it, budget it, and expend it, you can reveal it, I think.
Can I just add, and it's a point I made previously before this committee, and I made in my book, Money and Politics. Political parties are key democratic institutions, yeah? And it goes to the point that Senator McGrath made, and we think about the major parties, one crucial function and unique function they actually perform is actually forging an agenda for government. And those parties compete on those different agendas for government. And in that way, that distinguishes them from what might be called third-party campaigners under electoral law or non-government organizations. So when we sort of think about this political funding regime, one of the key goals is to support political parties as key democratic institutions. And it seems to me that at least when it comes to the specific point about public funding, there are two ways it does this, right? One, I think, goes to Senator McGrath's point, is about providing enough funding so that there can be proper compliance. And I think, Senator McGrath, what you referred to about treasurers of branches and so on and so forth, my in-depth investigation, New South Wales and so on and so forth, is that there needs to be clearly political parties rely a lot on volunteer effort or, what a previous chair of this committee said are amateurs. But I think when it comes to financial affairs, there needs to be a high level of professionalization. Yeah, just given the money involved and so on and so forth. And in that way to actually free up the volunteers from the compliance activity and to focus, if you like, on the policy or the campaigning activity. So that's one aspect of public funding to support political parties at key democratic institutions. The other one, which I've advocated, and I think finds its way in terms of Centre for Public Integrity submission, is to basically use public funding as a lever for encouraging membership. So what you might have is a public funding system that basically is also based on the number of members a political party has. Yeah. So there's incentives for political parties to get members, but also recognizing that membership also requires costs in terms of maintenance, in terms of holding meetings, and so on and so forth. So I'll leave it there.
Cool. And with the chair's forbearance, I do have one sort of final line of questioning, and it does come from Queensland again. There's been references against the Queensland regime in terms of the disclosure regime, but also the cap on campaign expenditure, which I think you're broadly in supportive of. The danger is that you have effectively a financial gerrymander brought in against one side of politics if you do have an expenditure, if the expenditure cap is not introduced fairly. I can give you the example that in Queensland that registered third parties, i.e. unions, can spend sort of just over $1 million centrally and then $90,000 in each seat. So each union who are traditionally affiliated or connected to one side of politics can spend, $10 million roughly across Queensland, whereas the political parties, Labor and the LNP, are capped at $15 million. So you effectively have the centre-right side of politics capped at 15 million, but you have Labor on the other side also capped at 15 million, but their connected third parties can then also spend up to, under the Queensland rules, and it's on fact sheet 12 from memory, it was put out by the ECQ, they can spend also almost $10 million. Do you think that's right?
Sorry, Colin.
Somebody else want to go first? I can't see.
Okay, I'll just briefly go first. I think, it really goes, what we're looking at are fair elections. And I think what your question raises is how do we understand fairness? I don't understand fairness simply as saying the two major parties should be able to spend the same amount of money. Yeah. Or that the two parties with supporting organizations will spend the same amount of money. If any party actually has organizations that are membership-based organizations supporting them, and they spend accordingly, I think that's actually considered to be fair. There's a question you raised, Senator, in terms of the trade unions and in terms of are they really, I suppose, let's put it very crudely, just really front organizations for the Labour Party. I covered this for a report for the New South Wales Electoral Commission, which basically the same issues arise in that jurisdiction as it arises in other jurisdictions. And what we see, of course, is that the Labour trade unions do have strong relationships with the Labour Party, but they clearly, as you all would know better than I do, they're not synonymous with the Labour Party. In New South Wales, for example, we've had in elections where public service unions have campaigned actively against the Labour Party and so on and so forth. Now, when the campaigns are coordinated, I think there's a fair argument to be made that the expenditure be aggregated, but I wouldn't presume that simply because the trade unions are spending amount of money, that somehow that should be seen as basically as necessarily in support of the Labour Party. I think it depends on the context.
Sorry, Dr.
Senator, I don't know whether what goes on in Queensland is necessarily central to what we're trying to solve here at the federal level, although I take your point. And over the years of research into this area, I must say that the one thing I've always heard from anybody on the Liberal or National Party, they always raise trade unions, and I can understand why. But on the reverse side, too, to that, business overwhelmingly supports the other side of Parliament, and if we're going to try and work out what's fair, what are we going to do about independence? So I do wonder that if there was a really significant imbalance in terms of trade unions, then you wouldn't be able to explain perhaps why, we overwhelmingly seem to have Liberal National Party governments in Australia more than we do Labor Party. So while I understand the issue you're raising, as now I'm repeating myself a bit here about trade unions and the fact that trade unions will actually even go out and some shouldn't, but they do even put signs on the transport that they use to drive around when they're a publicly funded organisation. But I think rules can help to deal with that sort of thing. But, I think you need to keep in mind that business gives a lot of money to the party they see that supports them more. So, I don't think it's all that one-sided.
Yeah, but what we're talking about is, with respect, is that, first of all, business does give money to both sides of politics, and the disclosure regime shows that. But what has been proposed is an expenditure regime that will limit the expenditure of one side of politics, of all sides of politics, but particularly disadvantage the centre-right of politics, because it will allow the left-wing side of politics to use their traditional links to trade unions who are affiliated to the Labor Party and allow them a strong financial advantage over one side of politics. So my position is that an expenditure regime that allows third parties to spend the money that they can in Queensland, two unions can legally outspend what the opposition party can. And that is bringing in a financial gerrymander. And I thought that if the witnesses were for fairness and openness, that you would oppose such a regime being introduced at a federal level.
I didn't know there was a suggestion that it was going to be introduced at a federal level. So I think and I'm happy to be corrected if that's something I haven't seen, that's what's intended at the federal level, but I haven't actually come across it. But in my submission, you will see about caps on donations that I actually do say that it should apply to every source regardless. And I think in one part of it, I do even include trade unions in it. So you'll find that in my submission, Senator.
Okay, I'll just note that we are running slightly over time. Senator McGrath.
I think I've just got one final question, sorry. It just goes to how the current regime operates now we've got candidates who have corporate structures operating their finances. Would the witnesses care to comment on that?
Are you referring to one particular person?
Well, there's been news reports about some of the independents who've been elected who do have corporate structures operating their finances, and I was just wondering whether any of the witnesses would like to comment on that, and would a new scheme need to require these structures to provide similar levels of transparency on donations and disclosure?
I think I referred to two people that have had quite substantial donations in two elections ago, and then this current election with a new person coming into it. So that's in my submission. But the point I make in my submission that had the political donations regime been reformed, then and we had a cap on the amount of money that anybody can donate to a political campaign, then we would not have had the position whereby somebody could actually donate 80 or to 100 million and somebody else considerably millions. We still don't know exactly the figure yet, I don't think, but, we're talking millions here. And I think I make the point that had the Parliament acted to change the laws, this wouldn't have happened in the latest election. So it's up really to the Parliament and members of Parliament to change it so it doesn't happen in the next election.
And the other two witnesses, would they care to comment?
My general view, Senator, is that, we want to have effective disclosure, including to funding to candidates, and that corporate structures shouldn't be allowed to be allow for the evasion of these disclosures. And saying that, and really comparatively what I'm saying is that I'm not quite sure that this is a problem with the law itself, because the definition of gift under the Commonwealth Electoral Act basically gifts made directly or indirectly to capture gifts made directly, indirectly to candidates. So if you give it to corporate entity that's clearly dedicated to funding a campaign of a particular candidate, I would have thought that would be caught by our disclosure laws presently. But again, it's hard to, sometimes I feel I'm talking a bit in the abstract right now, but Senator, if you want to give more details in terms of the facts, I'm happy to take a question and notice and provide a fuller answer.
All right.
Senator... And Professor Beck, sorry, does Professor Beck wish to comment?
Yeah, just piggybacking off Professor Tam's last point, this just goes to the need for robust disclosure of all sources of political fundraising revenue, whether that is a donation, whether that is a $10,000 ticket to a fundraising dinner, which currently doesn't have to be disclosed, or whether that's a gift in kind, where someone sends off their accountant or their marketing guru to work for you, where you don't have to pay for it. All of that needs to be disclosed, whether it's directly or indirectly provided to assist your political activities, and that's why you need these proper disclosure changes, lowering the threshold, routine, regular reporting, not many months later, and full disclosure of all sources of revenue, just not the very narrow definition of gift. That's why full disclosure is the solution to, I think, that problem.
All right, thanks. Senator Grogan has a couple of quick questions. I recognise we are running past our lunch break, but I presume everyone's happy for just a few more questions and then we'll wrap up. Senator Grogan.
Thank you, Chair. I will be quick. I've got one point of clarification, and I'll just ask Professor Tham to answer the question, but if the other two witnesses have additional points, if you could put them on notice, that would be great. And then I have another question. Professor, you talked about a sort of a party secretary sign-off scenario for the truth in advertising piece. How far down the food chain do you think that should go in terms of materials? I'm thinking sort of in a federal election for a major political party running over 200 candidates. Would you be seeing that sort of process within that truth in advertising piece as going down to things like Facebook posts, or how would you see that actually working?
Yeah, it's a good question, Senator. I think what I'm suggesting is a mechanism can work only when the campaign is to some degree centralized. Yeah. So in terms of, and we can basically see it applying quite easily in terms of national campaigns for major parties, yeah, easily. And we probably can see it in terms of statewide campaigns. I think I can definitely see it in terms of candidate campaigns too. I mean, one thing that political scientists have been saying is that the degree in which, with the major parties, okay, put aside, with the major parties, how campaign operations have been increasingly centralized, both within the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and the Country Party. So I think I can see it down to the campaign candidate level. I think when it comes to other parties that are more decentralized, I think just need to give some thought about where in fact that particular kind of code of conduct approach, ex-ante code of conduct approach can apply. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all in terms of what I'm suggesting.
Okay, thank you. And the other point, now I just want to thank the three of you for your submissions. One thing that that I was particularly interested to understand better, you talk about the elements that are not disclosed, the undisclosed receipts within parties. And Professor Beck, you talk about the fact that all money to parties are about buying access. And I know this came up a little bit earlier. There is a whole range of people who don't engage in that sort of, in that contribution to the party for access. They do it because they're true believers and they want to see an agenda and they want to see policy issues as individuals in the community, not as big corporations or businesses that are going to benefit from it, but just as citizens. And I think there's that, where do we draw that line at the bottom end that says, well, if I'm buying $20 worth of raffle tickets because I want to see the Purple Party win the election and that's my way of contributing, or if I buy a $40 ticket to an afternoon event that who knows whether there'll be a politician there, maybe it's just a party gig, maybe a politician, maybe there'll be a few pollies there, but it's not like like I think there's a big difference between those kind of things, or the quiz night, or the, politics in the pub event, compared to, a 2,000 a head dinner for 5 people. So when you say capture everything, what do you see as the granular piece at that lower end, where a lot of that is very benign? Yes, it's funded. Yes, it should be disclosed. But do you see it as there was a raffle, $2,000 was made in the raffle, or do you see it as a granular piece of every individual party member who bought a ticket needs to be named?
No, so when I say everything, I mean all forms, all categories of fundraising above the threshold. So a $20 raffle ticket, whether that's Gina Reinhardt or random true believer down the street, no, that wouldn't need to be disclosed. You would have a disclosure threshold of, say, $1,000 so that you don't waste your energy on tiny raffle tickets and quiz nights.
But I think I think the problem... I think the problem is that when those, I think yours was the submission with the pie graphs in it that had the section that said undisclosed receipts, as if they were a deep evil. And I wonder...
So not all of them are. Not all of them are. you're absolutely right that some of those undisclosed receipts are the raffle tickets and so on by true believers and others, and that's not problematic. In fact, participation in political parties, as I think we've talked about, is a good thing. But even if you are a true believer and you're paying $10,000 to go to dinner with your local MP, that should be disclosed. Whether on it's a question
I'm
of
absolutely not talking about that.
everything above the threshold. So if it was a threshold of say $1,000, then that avoids the need to have those small amounts of revenue raised. Obviously, you'd want to disclose the cumulative total of that, but not, Luke paid $10 for some raffle tickets at last weekend's dinner, right? But if I pay $1,500 to go to dinner with the local MP, that should be disclosed. So it's disclosed everything above the threshold, and that way, full transparency, full daylight, and nobody can make accusations. I suppose it's building trust.
So again, another sort of clarifying point there. With that, say the majority of that undisclosed receipts was exactly that, was, umpteen small events that don't qualify. Do you see a value in saying, recognising that there was a raffle and it made 2,000 with no further detail, or that there was a social event or a community event and it raised $5,000?
For the purposes of disclosure, I don't think the compliance, the quid pro quo, the balancing of the compliance cost of that versus the public benefit of that, there may be internal benefit to knowing that so you can do your fundraising better. But does the public need to know whether last weekend's raffle raised $1,000 or $1,500? Probably not. So you would just disclose the global sum of everything raised under the threshold so that you know how much money the party got in total. So the war chest total amount. But individual sources of revenue above the threshold of, say, $1,000, all of those individual sources should be disclosed. So if the cumulative total for last weekend's raffle ticket drive at the barbecue was $2,000, but nobody paid more than $10 a ticket, well, then you wouldn't have to disclose anything other than chucking that $2,000 into the global other receipts fund. But at the moment, the other receipts fund is not just all of those perfectly innocent sources of revenue. It's a lot of money from people who are paying, $10,000 to go to dinner with ministers, right? So,
and just on that point, I think it's probably some parties, and whether you're in government or not in government, that those things change, right? Yep. And I think my personal opinion is that there's probably more of that innocuous stuff in there than you might think. But I agree with the disclosure. I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just interested in how you see that bottom end, the more innocuous stuff, because you're right, there is that category that says undisclosed receipts, and it's like, well, what's that? So I get that. So I guess that's my question.
So if you have the full disclosure regime, then people would be able to say, well, look, they've raised all that amount of money from small supporters. That's okay, right? But at the moment, nobody believes that because it's not true.
Can I just
and I think we'll flesh this one out and we'll move on.
Can I just make a quick comment?
Yes.
I'll make it quick, I'm sorry. We're trying to deal here with a national political donations regime that spends hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't think the raffle held somewhere it should be the thing that's exercising our minds. And if the argument is that there are many, many more funds that we don't realise come from these raffles, then let the political parties put that out there for us to see exactly in terms of their donations, how many come from chook raffles and how many comes from unions, big business, whatever else, billionaires, millionaires, and put it out there for the public to see, and then we can have a rational, good debate about where we should take this and what we should do about reforming it. So I strongly encourage political parties to tell us how much of these small donations they receive, and do they run into millions of dollars. This is information we need.
Just one teeny thing, sorry. And I think just to be really clear, that's not what I'm saying. All of your submissions talk about the big end, and you raise the issue of this section. And my question, which I don't want you to answer right now because I'm going to stop, is just what do you think that should look like in terms of recognising those things? What are your suggestions down there? So please don't misinterpret what I was trying to get at there.
And I think, sorry, comment as many anything. As a previous state director of a party in New South Wales, it's where the money ends up. So we did have people coming to us on the raffle ticket thing saying, how many branches you've got, I'll buy raffle tickets here, 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 here. And it was to circumvent the goodwill of what it was. So what has happened in New South Wales, there is one campaign account. Money that goes into that campaign account has to be disclosed, but branches can have branch accounts that can't be transferred. They can operate, they can run facilities, they can do all that sort of stuff for administration, for recruiting parties, but it can't go into the campaign. And it got amended because originally they couldn't even do that, and branch activity stopped. And so that was a change where the money ends up and what it can be used for as to where it goes.
Thank you, Senator Cadell. Thank you all. We really appreciate your time, the time you put in today, as well as your submissions. If the committee does have further questions, they will be put to you in writing, and you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. So thank you again. We will now break until 1 p.m. and come back then.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, and we'll resume our hearing, and I call upon Professor Williams and Dr. Edwards. For the Hansard record, could you state your full names and the capacity in which you're appearing before the committee?
My name is George John Williams from the University of New South Wales, and I appear in a private capacity.
We can't hear you, Dr. Edwards. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, Dr. Lindy Edwards, also from the University of New South Wales, also appearing in a private capacity.
Can we just get the volume turned up a bit in here? So we can... Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Did either of you have an opening statement you wanted to make before we proceed to discussion?
I do, if I must do that. Do you want to go first, George? Okay. So mine was very brief. I wanted to start by reiterating my support for the proposals that have been being iterated for several years now around putting caps on donations, just-in-time disclosure, spending in caps in political campaigns. And of course, I'd also like to add my voice to the truth in political advertising proposals. However, where I'd like to add to this debate is that we all know that there are limits to the effectiveness of laws on donations and spending because they can be got around by funneling funds to third-party actors. I'd like to propose an additional fail-safe where all of the parties to the new News Media Bargaining Code be required to give equal advertising space to the major parties and the commensurate up to the same level of space to minor parties. The intention is to reduce the advantage gained by the parties in amassing a campaign war chest by targeting the points of distribution and requiring them to ensure a level playing field. The participants in the new News Media Bargaining Code have just received a string of special protections in recognition of their important role in our democracy. And as a result, it would be appropriate to also then place obligations on them to protect that democracy. In targeting the distributors of media messaging, whether they're the newspapers or Google and Facebook, and requiring them to ensure that the major players in the political process are given equal voice, we can reduce both the distortive effects on parties competing to gain advantage by having more money to spend. It would reduce the distortive effects of fundraising on political decision making, and it would also reduce the distortive effect of uneven resourcing in shaping electoral outcomes. regulations could be extended beyond the parties and the parties to the News Media Bargaining Code to include those subject to radio and TV licences and to apply to third-party advocates. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll say a couple of words as well. I also appreciate the opportunity to appear and welcome the breadth of issues that the committee is going to be looking at. We do have a strong electoral system. Much can be said for the quality of the Australian Electoral Commission and the work that it does. And there's much to be said also for our very positive electoral culture, particularly compared to some other countries. But the strength of our system does depend on us keeping the system up to date. It does depend on us responding to problems as they emerge. And unfortunately, we've had a lost nearly 2 decades where we have failed to respond to many serious issues that have arisen around the electoral process and the conduct of federal elections. And hence we come to this inquiry with a smorgasbord of reforms being put on the table, many of which should have been made many, many years ago. And it's telling, for example, if we look around issues of political finance, where the system is well known to be broken, that this, perhaps it might be about the 10th inquiry I've appeared at alone, where exactly the same issues have been raised. And I'm hopeful that this is the first time, perhaps we'll break the duck after 10 inquiries, of actually getting some meaningful reform in this area. I'd also say that those lost decades are reflected in public opinion. In a number of areas, the public opinion is well beyond where Parliament has taken us. It's well recognised in the community that we do need to fix things like political falsehoods, the broken system of political finance, and hence you look at overwhelming opinion polls that say people do want to see integrity and fairness brought back more strongly to our electoral system. I'd also say when it comes to the franchise, there are key issues there that frankly should have been dealt with some time ago. A very good example is the outdated and somewhat offensive reference to people of unsound mind being unable to vote. That was recommended for change a long time ago. It should have been done many years ago. And again, I hope that's yet another example of something we can now remedy by way of bringing the Electoral Act up to a more modern and appropriate standard.
Okay, thank you. I might start with you, Professor Williams, and I share your desire that we get action out of this hearing in some of those areas that we are examining as part of this inquiry. So I might start with a broad question for you and also for Dr. Edwards if she wants to address it. What's the risk to our democracy if we don't take this opportunity to legislate for reform of donations, campaign spending and funding?
I think the risk is twofold. One is the risk we've already seen manifested across past elections where money will impact upon the integrity of the electoral process, both by distorting preferences because we don't properly regulate the use of money, and also the possibility that we'll see what's a form of soft corruption, that money will be given in return for access, potential policy outcomes and the like. And that's been well documented in a number of areas. But the second and large issue is that we will be threatening public confidence. There are high expectations that this Parliament will remedy these issues. And if that is not done, it will simply again erode public trust in the electoral system, in institutions, in Parliament. So if nothing, I'd say on this particular occasion, the stakes have never been higher because of those expectations, because of the public record. And I would say as a result that we do need to fix these things now, lest the consequences become even larger.
Can I add to that? I think that there's a risk of a sense of complacency after our electoral system, I think, has coped reasonably well with the challenges thrown at it in comparison particularly to the US and the UK. However, we need to be aware that we've been a bit lucky. But to be honest, if Clive Palmer had used his resources more effectively, he could have had a much, much larger impact than he has. And that I think that we need to, I think we need to be quite, I think one of the risks I think we can see a number of ways in which the system seemed to self-stabilise quite well in the last election. And yet, as we look forward and think about the next one, that if, in a sense, one of the, some of the cushions around the last electoral outcome was that we had a reasonably populist government that was being challenged by when we think about the likes of Clive Palmer, by folk that were not perhaps using their resources that well. However, the scope for the sorts of outcomes that we're seeing in the US, if we can, if we look forward 2 or 3 years, and the likelihood that we're going to go into a severe economic downturn in the context of a more dangerous international environment and a growing, a growing set of social challenges, we're going into a period whereby the risks of the rise of forms of dangerous populism are really very evident, and that the need to protect against the things that we can already see are really significant vulnerabilities by what we're seeing in the US and the UK at the moment, in terms of particularly the ability for high wealth individuals to be able to really significantly distort the political process. Is something that we should be really concerned about at the moment.
Okay, thank you both. We just had a big discussion with our last session about capping political donations and the potential effect of that on third parties and on smaller people or smaller donations who may want to participate in democracy and aren't sort of the big money you're looking at. Do you have a view on how you design a system of donation reform that still allows for that sort of work, but does address things like Clive Palmer that you're talking about there?
I think that there's a number of, I think that notion that we've kind of got a bit of a choice between, at the moment, we've got a reasonably small number of people who participate in the political financing process, only sort of 12 to 1,400 that are really fund all of our election campaigns. The move towards, the move from a small number high value donations towards the large number low volume donation system, I think is something to be encouraged. We do need to be aware that there are some challenges associated with it, in the sense that the ways that people mobilise people to make donations aren't always entirely fabulous. But certainly our system would at this stage benefit from moving towards the high volume, low value donations and fundraising models.
And one advantage, of course, in the federal parliament taking so long to regulate this is that there's a lot of evidence from the states, from other countries about what works and does not work. And we also know the likely approach of the High Court. And of course, there are real constitutional impediments here as well. But what I think we've learned is that it would be wise to construct a system that does cap donations at about $5,000. And here I'd commend you the Centre for Public Integrity submission. I'm a board member there. I support that submission. It's a very well-researched, carefully articulated submission about where the cap should be set. Equally, we need real-time disclosure, or I'd point to Queensland in particular. That's a 7-day period or 24 hours within an election period, with everything over $1,000 being disclosed. And I think within that framework, you essentially have the guardrails of a system that seeks to remove the distorting influence of very large donations while providing disclosure and transparency and providing, as we should, freedom for people to make donations. I think that's an important part of our system. They can do so. I don't support removing donations. I just think it's appropriate to regulate it, given the dangers of not doing so.
And can I ask you to elaborate on, in that system, how we do design a model that meets constitutional tests?
And there have, of course, been now a number of High Court decisions looking at this. And the important thing is that the system is designed to deal with known problems and to do so in a way that is fair and not arbitrary. And by not arbitrary, for example, as occurred in New South Wales, it looked like you were simply targeting third-party campaigners and you were to change their threshold without any sense as to why that was appropriate. Well, that would be a problem. But if, on the other hand, this committee took the evidence, saw the problems and felt that this was a reasonable and fair way of regulating, then that's exactly what the High Court would give weight to. And the evidence from the High Court is that it would accept the constitutionality of regulating donations in this way. It's already been very well tested. And I think we could, with good confidence, say if we designed a system, say, according to how the Centre for Public Integrity is suggesting, that fits within how the current High Court has upheld other regimes.
So we shouldn't be letting legal questions stop us from acting, is what you're saying?
No, look, definitely not. And what we should say is if Parliament was minded to privilege one participant over another, that would be a problem. And in fact, you can look back to 1992 when the High Court first struck down a measure of this kind with broadcast advertising, and there the High Court said it's not a level playing field. It's designed to privilege the major parties against new entrants. So if Parliament seeks to design something that's not a level playing field, that will be a constitutional problem. But if, on the other hand, it takes expert evidence, goes according to what that evidence suggests, then I think you're on safe ground. And that indeed is what the record shows in the High Court. And the High Court and the Constitution is not an impediment to regulating this. It's just an impediment if it's done in an unfair or partisan way.
Thank you. I might move to truth in political advertising. Professor Williams, in your submission, you said that we should look at a narrowly drawn law for truth in political advertising that only targets a spread of information that can be proven to be false, and no attempt should be made to regulate opinion or ideas in contested areas. Can I get you to expand on that and why you put that in there?
Sure, look, I couldn't have said it better myself, but yes.
Very well said.
That's exactly my view. And I start from the point of view that we do commonly regulate falsehoods where they cause harm. So a company cannot say false things about their product to make a buck. People can't lie about other people in ways that affect their reputation. There are many examples of this. So the failure to regulate political lies that do enormous harm to our electoral process by distorting preferences and the like, I think there's equally a strong case for reform. But I think we have to be, of course, very alive to the constitutional issues. That's one factor. But also, we just don't want this to become a litigious area. We want to deal with the extremes. We don't want to deal with whether it's a valid opinion or not. Hence, I would say that all we should target at this point are things that can be demonstrably shown to be false. That's quite a narrow, limited category. We also know that's been successfully done in South Australia since 1985 and now in the ACT as well. And I think if we did that, it would regulate without going too far this problem that we're facing. The only other thing I would add is when we look at the South Australian law, as I say in my submission, I think it's well calibrated, but I think we could look at some tougher penalties. I think there's too high a risk with the South Australian law that falsehoods will be just seen as a cost of campaigning, pay a fine but win the election. And so I think we do need to deal with more deliberate and what might even be malicious actions that amount to political lies. It's possible we should look to criminal sanctions in that case, or at least much, much higher fines. But otherwise, I'd commend the South Australian and ACT models as narrowly drawn, constitutionally safe models that would properly tackle this problem.
Dr. Edwards, did you want to add something on that?
No, I would just endorse that view. I think it's, we don't want a situation of running court cases in the lead up to elections. We saw that in the lead up to the last ACT election with David Pocock and the Greens, with issues around that. And it was very unfortunate that there were very long delays in resolving those questions of whether or not those materials should have been available. So we certainly want to avoid that becoming part of the gamesmanship.
Okay, thank you. Senator McGrath, do you have some questions? Are you on the line?
No.
He's not on the line.
I think he's on a plane.
Right, he's on a plane. Senator Cadell, are you taking this one?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Interesting you raised the points of Clive Palmer's money potentially affecting the outcome of campaign if used wisely. Why are we not looking at the more successful campaign of the corporates of Simon Holmes à Court and Chris Barter and others and their success of their money entering campaigns? Why is Clive Palmer always held up as the example?
Good question.
Well, so I mean, I think that
Because we like that?
pardon?
Easier to do this.
I mean, I actually think it's a reasonably in the current context, it's actually useful to have the two sets of examples. That on the one hand, I think it's valuable for the political system to be able to have challenges that can actually get up. And on the other hand, there's also, and on the other hand, when you've also got quite clear commercial interests driving particular campaigns, that also becomes a challenge. So I actually think it's quite useful to look at the TEALS process and suggest that actually it's, for those that consider that to have been a valuable exercise, what are the characteristics that make that possible? And we certainly don't want, so I guess that highlights the need to be thinking about what these fundraising vehicles are that make,
It's almost a case of 2 legs good, 4 legs bad. I see on this one. It's or other way around. It's a bit funny.
Well, I just say, I find it, look, it's absolutely the most extreme case. I think that's fair to say, just simply on the dollars. But it's a good question because I think exactly the same problem can be identified in all of the campaigns at different magnitudes. The mere fact that no campaign was required to disclose amounts under about $15,000, that was a problem, whether it be Teals, Labor, Greens, it doesn't matter, to be frank. For me, I'm quite agnostic as to parties. I would just say everyone should be subject to the same level playing field, the same rules. And I wouldn't suggest any party or person except to say that no one should be able to spend extreme amounts without being subject to the same rules that everyone should be subject to that would be in the best interest of the community.
Not a problem. When, Professor Williams, you talk about level playing field for all the money going in, are you talking about all sources? Are you talking about the High Court's rule of keeping it fair, keeping it level? Are we talking about everything's memberships, affiliations, donations, all sources of income that goes into campaigns?
Yeah, I think we need a holistic approach. I think as soon as you start exempting significant amounts, then you open room for distortion. And it's one reason, for example, that we equally need to regulate third-party campaigners. Otherwise, you'll find we have what occurs in the US is third-party vehicles simply become the mechanism for fundraising and action. So no, I do support holistic. I think it's appropriate that you might have you allow things like some low-level membership fees and things like that. But here again, I commend the Centre for Public Integrity submission. It deals with those issues in quite a comprehensive way. But yes, I accept where you're coming from, that we should be looking across the board at funding that goes into supporting these activities.
Okay. And interesting question, aside from this thing, you've mentioned about the 16-year-old votes and potential of a voluntary voting system for under 16s. That brings the campaigning spectrum, I think, of the US, of the Get Out the Vote campaign over the compulsory. We're very centrist where people have to vote here, campaigning in the centre. If you're getting Get Out the Vote campaigns, don't we suddenly go to the extremes for we're motivating you enough to get out of bed and go have a vote, so therefore we will say something we wouldn't normally say?
Yeah, again, it's a good question, and I certainly support our system of compulsory voting for 18s and above, but I think if we did move to 16 and 17-year-olds voting, as the UK and other places are doing, that at least as a transitional measure, I would support voluntary voting for that age group. I think it's small enough that it's unlikely to provide the distortion you're saying, and it may well be over a period of time we move to compulsory voting. But I think it's a pretty modest incremental path, and I'd say it's a pretty pragmatic approach as well. And I think, given the numbers, unlikely to lead to those problems.
Okay. And final question, on your 44s, I agree entirely. I think we've high courted quite reasonably where we need to be on nationality of MPs. The Office of Profit under the Crown, what would you say, get involved in that, have a look at it? I know pharmacists are ruled out, which you would say they're small businesses and they get their pharmaceutical benefit scheme, so they're of concern, hasn't been tested by the court. What would you suggest for remedying 44 for some of these? I mean, in doctors under Medicare, we're ruling out a lot of people who care for their communities from taking part in this process at the moment.
Yeah, we are, and I know the Nationals, for example, have had real problems in Western Australia with small business people. It can also include farmers and others who take apprentices that are supported by Commonwealth activities, and it just cuts a swathe through groups of people we would like to see standing for Parliament for all parties. And what it does is forces them to divest themselves of their business interests at the point of nomination before they even know the result. And that's really unfair. I'd also say it's equally unfair that a public servant who's running must resign their job even before they know whether they're elected. So the simplest thing to do, as I suggest, would be just to put the words in "until Parliament otherwise provides" at the beginning of the section, which should have been there in the first place. It's there in other equivalent sections. And that then lets Parliament regulate these things. And one thing it might simply do is to say, well, you must divest yourself, but only once you're actually elected. And at that point, that's fair enough. But before then, it's not reasonable for that to occur.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Waters, did you have questions?
I do. Thank you very much, Chair. And hi there to our witnesses, Dr. Edwards and Professor Williams. Thanks for your work in this field and your evidence so far. Can I start off with donations reform? Professor Williams, I heard your proposition that there be a $5,000 cap on all donors, political donors. Can I ask for your response to, I have a private members bill which sets a cap of $1,000 per year of political donations, and that would apply to all donors, so individuals, organisations, corporates, whomever. Can I ask for your input on that level of cap, but also point out that the model that the Greens have used has bans on particular industries, so big pharma, big mining companies, alcohol, gambling, a gamut of industries that have previously, in our view, been shown to exert political influence and buy political outcomes using money, which seems to subvert democracy in our view. What's your view on banning donations from certain sectors and on that lower cap that we've proposed in the past?
I prefer a system where we reduce the amount that can be donated rather than targeting certain industries, unless it's a particularly extreme case. But for me, I think if you reduce the level of donation, it removes a lot of the heat about certain industries contributing. And equally, I think it is problematic to pick and choose. As much as we might say, well, no this, no that, it's not fossil fuels, but what about this, what about that? I think that itself becomes a distorting influence. And I think it's better to have an open-ended donation system that simply reduces the influence of everyone by instead suggesting you get more donations in from different groups. As to the threshold, I do think 1,000 is too low. I look at the experience in New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria, and also overseas, and I think the evidence suggests that something about $5,000 is sufficient to take the heat out of the system, because it's at a much higher level that is likely to produce more influence, distortion, even forms of soft corruption. And I think 1,000 is arguably too low, because I think, again, I don't think we need to go that low to solve the problem. And it is about solving the problem. And I am someone who believes it's appropriate that people and others can give money to political parties to demonstrate their beliefs. And I think 5,000 is good enough to fix the problem without needing to go lower. The key is that disclosure. So 1 to 5,000, real-time disclosure. The community deserves to know. And I think, again, with disclosure and the other elements of the system, that's sufficient and appropriate.
Can I add anything, Dr. Edwards?
Yeah, could I make a point on the issue of disclosure? That I think that for those of us that have spent a lot of time going through the existing disclosures, it's reasonably clear that they're very, very opaque, and that actually simply putting up spreadsheets on a website, particularly at a time at which journalists don't really have the time to sort through that data, is still, it's better than nothing, but not a lot better. It would be more useful for information to be able to be so one of the key things that we're concerned about with donations is the idea of it distorting decision making. And what I think would be valuable would be that in addition to the straight list of donations, is that when legislation is brought forward, that that with that legislation, in much the same way as a regulation impact statement, we also got a political donations and lobbying statement, which classed the different groups of stakeholders, the amounts of money received from the different groups of stakeholders, and the time which they were given with the relevant decision makers. And the goal here is to create an incentive for decision makers to make sure that they're keeping the playing field level, for them to be able to check in and go, wait a moment, when I've got to stand up and put up this legislation, do I want it to look like I've taken all of the money and spent all of the time with these groups? Do I need to be seeking out input from other stakeholders in this process? And I think that presenting that, a handful of pie graphs that represented that information in a way which is very easy for journalists to reproduce would be enormously useful, and certainly a lot more useful than the current disclosure regime.
Thanks, Dr. Atkins. I find that a very intriguing idea. So thank you for proposing it. In your model, does that disclosure operate in addition to cap, or are you proposing it instead of a cap on donations?
I think it's ideally in addition. I think that we can expect that when we do change the rules to be having smaller caps, I think we can still expect significant mobilisations around issues, and that that I think that it's still very useful for it to be disclosed whether or not particular groups of stakeholders are being able to increase their voice in one way or another, and for the politicians involved to have an incentive to be making sure that the level playing field in terms of who gets access to them and their level of voice remains as equitable as possible.
Yes, thank you. I hope that the committee gives some serious consideration to that suggestion. I think that's a really, really positive proposal. Can I just harken back, Professor Williams? We've talked a little bit about donations. I'm interested to know if you're proposing that there be electoral spending caps in addition to donations caps, or if you're seeing them as in the alternative.
No, I think it's part of the complete package. And again, the evidence from overseas and the states is you need all of those elements. And the reason you need the caps on expenditure is that's what, again, takes the heat out of the need to fundraise in the first place. If we don't have the expenditure caps, we'll still have an arms race, and people will look to subvert the rules as best they can in order to get an electoral advantage. So it's really about donations caps, expenditure caps, disclosure. Those three elements are all needed for a robust and fair system.
Thank you. In the previous session, Professor Tam, who I know you'll be familiar with his work, proposed the idea in relation to truth in advertising, proposed the idea that rather than it being a post facto situation where, potentially the damage is already done, or, it's just seen as a cost of doing business, that instead there be a code which party secretaries could certify against, that, this ad complies with the code, and potentially there's a large penalty that could go along with certifying something when it in fact shouldn't have been certified. What's your view on that model of a truth in advertising, that it try to catch the problem before it happens?
It sort of sounds good in theory, but I doubt it would work in practice. As we know, election campaigns move very quickly. If you think of how quickly someone might like to put an online ad or response up, very happy in a fast-moving campaign, very hard in a fast-moving campaign, I think, to comply with that. And also, of course, it's not just ads, it's statements. It could be someone telling a lie in a media interview. So I think it would be helpful to parties, perhaps whoever manages this, that it can provide some comfort. Yes, it can be looked at to pre-clear, but I wouldn't be making it mandatory. I'd more see it as assistance to parties, that they know they're on the right side. And again, I don't think this scheme should be too heavy. I think we've got a really robust open democracy. And so for me, it is light touch regulation focused on the extremes that we need to cut out, rather than adding anything too elaborate into the mix.
Thank you. Did you have a view on that, Dr. Edwards?
No.
That's fine. I've got other questions, so don't force a view if you don't already hold one. Okay, I've got two other questions. Hopefully I've got time for those, Chair. I'll try to be quick. Just on that issue of 16 and 17-year-olds voting, Professor Williams, you sort of suggested that that could be potentially on a voluntary basis. I wonder, I'd like to put to you, what's your view of making it compulsory so as not to undermine the notion of compulsory voting in our nation, but that any fine would be waived for 16 and 17-year-olds who chose not to vote? Do you think that's an elegant solution? Or
that would be a clever way of having a voluntary system while retaining the compulsory. I like
too clever, perhaps?
Yeah, I like the suggestion, and as I say, I see it as an incremental transitional path, but I do see the strength in the arguments. And if it was felt it needed to be compulsory, with or without a fine, I would still support that. I do so because of my engagement with this age group over a long period of time. I do so because of how it's been successful in places like Scotland, many places around the world. This is where the next movement of enfranchising people is going. And I think we can talk about the details, but I think at some point this will happen in Australia as with elsewhere. And I would support either form, but at the moment, given where we are, as I say, a more modest and incremental in what I'm suggesting.
Right, thank you. Now, Dr. Edwards, I have a detailed question here for you. You talked about levelling the playing field and particularly about the advantage of incumbency for the larger parties, and you've flagged media regulation requiring proportionate advertising space, which I'm intrigued by. But do you have any views on any other advantages that the incumbent parties and larger parties currently enjoy? For example, excluding minor parties from leaders' debates, which is something that the Greens have taken issue with over successive years, so far unsuccessfully. Also in relation to regulating government advertising before an election, which has obviously come up in the media in the last few weeks. Also in relation to fixed terms. And lastly, in relation to any potential differing spending cap for minor parties versus, or incumbents versus non-incumbents. All of those things over to you.
I don't believe it's in our terms.
Look, that's not an area in which I've got particular expertise, so I won't necessarily add a great deal to that. Yeah, I'm sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. My mistake.
No, that's okay. That's all right.
Professor Williams, if you have anything to add on any of those points, feel free to.
Look, fixed terms, yes. I think, again, the Commonwealth is now the outlier there. And the fact that referendums have been successfully held in a number of state jurisdictions demonstrates the willingness of the community to support change. I worked a lot with David Coleman on the coalition side over previous parliaments. He had a very good and robust proposal that I would like to see come forward in this area. When it comes to things like debates, major and minor parties, for me, I wouldn't be regulating that. I think, again, I just think we need to be cautious how far we go. There are often unintended consequences in these areas, and I'm really focused on what I'd see as some of the larger problems within how the electoral process is run, and really the role of public authorities in doing so. And I'd be sticking there. And there's enough on the agenda, I think, without going further. But the other ones I'd mentioned to you, I think, that we haven't talked about is I think the franchise is a large one. I mentioned 16 and 17-year-olds, but that's significant. But for me, it is people with intellectual disabilities. There are major problems there. Discrimination that needs to be fixed, that the Law Reform Commission has identified, long overdue, and frankly a bit shameful that this Parliament has not dealt with that problem to this point. And then there's also overseas Australians. The UK has just removed its limit on expats voting. And we've got this really unfortunate and convoluted approach where if you intend to come back to Australia within 6 years, you can vote, but who knows often what they intend to do. It's a really difficult test. And we're disenfranchising our own citizens in ways other countries don't. So those two areas, it's a starting point I'd be focusing on, because I think it is time to ask again who should vote. And I think it's clear it's now in need of reform.
Just on that last point, Professor Williams, and thanks for raising that. So you've said you think that 6-year intention rule should be removed. I think when we had the AEC before us, they said that, if I'm remembering the figures correctly, 40,000 fewer votes in the most recent election were returned than the one prior to that. In part, that was due to COVID and the reduced number of in-person voting facilities. Do you think that, can you just elaborate more on what you think needs to be done to enfranchise our actual citizens, irrespective of where they're choosing to live?
Well, I'd go the approach of the United States, Canada, France, now the United Kingdom. It's a very long list who say if you're a citizen, you're entitled to vote. Full stop. And we are now an outlier amongst those countries, not only in stopping some of our expats from voting, but also in having a rule conditioned upon the intent of when you intend to come back to Australia. But as we know, I mean, pandemics, personal circumstances, employment, I mean, intents change all the time. It's just a really unfortunate and to be frank, flawed criterion upon which to base it on. So either I would say we should say if you're a citizen you could vote, as the UK now does. I think that's the preferable course. Or if it was felt that we still need a limit, it should be a more generous limit. It might say if you have resided outside of Australia for 10 years or more. So it's based on something that's much easier to determine, residence for 10 years, not intent. That would liberalise it a bit, get to a better position. And that might be a halfway house to actually getting to what these other countries have already got.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair. I've got some other questions, but I'm happy to pass the call over.
Thanks, Senator Waters. Did you have some more questions,
Thanks,
Senator Goodell?
Just to follow up on, you spoke about some donation caps, but we come, not all things are created equal. We come across a situation where if I can donate to corporate, the Labor Party, the National Party, because we're awesome, and others, $5,000 each. But if I want to donate to a group that is unincorporated, I can donate to them. They can run 151 candidates and I can donate 151 times to that organisation. Do you see the possibility of introducing a donors cap as well? So potentially as a donor, I am limited to giving a number of 3 times that, and then I have to choose how I give my funds amongst the different candidates and parties running. Hello?
Oh, sorry, was that to me?
Either
or
of
was
you,
that-
great, yep.
Did you want to jump in on that, George?
You go first, Lindy.
Look, I think in the donations regime at the moment, we already have the requirement for donors to aggregate their total payments. That
only for each party. Only for each party, not across.
Only for each party. But I think that notion of there being different potential vehicles of payment splitting and of using that as a way of trying to get around it. I think that at this stage, it's seen, I think to take George's point about going light touch as you can until you've got a problem that needs solving, that it's not clear that that has at this point emerged as a significant issue. I mean, if, for example, the Teals model becomes, if there is a sense that that becomes an issue, then that would be something to consider. But I'm not sure. And it should be, and if that is the way that it evolves, one would expect that it should be seen as an exercise in donation splitting. But I think that quite possibly by the end of this parliament, I think these questions around, I think that issue of the community independence movement is quite an interesting one, and whether or not, I would tend to agree towards thinking that you should probably only be able to support a certain number, but I think that you need to think carefully about what that number should be, and so perhaps as it unfolds as an issue, that might become clearer. George, did you have a thought on that?
Look, I think it's a reasonable point. I think yes, I can see the possibility for distortion, as Lindy says. It's not as evident at that end of the scale as at other end. So it's a question of whether it's compelling enough to intervene. I'd also look at the regulatory cost of doing it. We don't want a system where we move from candidates and parties doing disclosures to anyone who makes a donation having to disclose.
They do now.
So really
if they're over disclosure now, they already have to. And this is where the Australian system is funny, because I can take $13,000 a day as a political party from anyone I want and not disclose it, but they have a requirement to disclose it.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about the impact upon them of potentially a lot of small donations and, picking up people who give small amounts across a number of groups. And that's really what I'm focused on. But it's a matter of calibration. So for me at the moment, I can see the issue, but it doesn't strike me as compelling a problem as some of the others to solve at the moment, but it may become so. And in which case I can understand the reason to regulate.
Okay.
Can I jump back to the comment before about setting up the disclosures around stakeholder groups? That in fact that could be a way in which this issue could be dealt with, in the sense that. So the way in which I come at these issues is I am coming at things from a lobbying background rather than an elections background, as George has. But from a lobbying background, if the approach is to, if you're seeking to set out so my approach is that I think that we should have the equivalent of a COVID app, which says, right, I am now having a meeting with my elected representative on this issue, and that should create data that spits out at the end of when a piece of legislation that comes forward which says this amount of time was spent by these groups with these decision makers, and the decision makers should be able to see that and to be able to keep in mind, if you like, the balance of who it is that they're speaking to. And that as a part of that process, I would also be attaching the financing associated with that, and that the process of doing that would then mean that you'd be seeking to, if people were then, so people who are giving money that are then also having meetings with decision makers, that money should then be captured.
No, I just want to see the privatisation of democracy. I think you've seen it in a couple of different ways. I think patting ourselves on the self-praise is no praise, but I think the party structure defended well against both Palmer and the Teal corporatisation. I think we have to do everything we can to avoid, as I said, previous involvement in campaigns, you would look at the rules and work out how you turn them to your favour. And I think the light touch thing is fine, but there needs to be a quick change mechanism for when someone discovers a comparative advantage in one area, like splitting payments.
Chair.
Yes, Senator Payne.
Thank you. May I just ask a couple of quick questions?
Yes.
Thank you. Professor Williams, good to see you. It was something that you said early in your remarks, and I wasn't quite sure what you meant, and I wanted to seek some clarification. You talked about money distorting preferences, and I don't really know what you meant in the context of the comments you were making at the time. Can you explain that to me, please?
Yeah, I'm referring to it in two ways. One is that large amounts of money well deployed through advertising can obviously affect how people vote. And of course, that's the reason that people seek the money in the first place. But where you have extreme amounts in some areas and not a level playing field, that can lead to distorting outcomes that mean preferences aren't actually a true representation of how people would normally cast their vote. So, you see it in the US all the time. Money speaks, and if you want a system where essentially those who raise the most money are the most likely to be successful, well, that's the system you could have, but it's problematic. But the other distortion I was referring to is the temptation or likelihood that people who receive large donations will tailor their policies in running for office in order to favour those people who are giving them large donations. And doing so knowing that even if it's not entirely popular, they might get the money they need nonetheless to convince the community and win the contest.
So in the abstract, I understand what you're saying, but if we go back to, and it's not my example, someone else used it first, but if we go back to the example of Mr. Palmer and his very significant spending in relation to the election campaign, which on any empirical assessment has not significantly, if you like, influenced preferences in terms of outcomes. We have Senator Babet in the Senate, of course, but beyond that, I think Australians probably have shown a reasonably healthy scepticism, and I think that's a good thing about our political system, frankly, in relation to these issues. One of the matters that we discussed earlier today was raised by Senator McGrath with previous witnesses in relation to how you manage third parties who are able to make very, very significant contributions, and third parties particularly that have, in some cases, an inviolable link to one of the traditional parties, and there are examples in state legislation where they are still able to spend very significant amounts of money. So my observation, and I'd be interested in your comments, is that any legitimate and realistic approach on these issues has to be able to address those sorts of compromised circumstances.
Yeah, I agree, Senator, and I know with, say, the Queensland legislation, this was a really major issue, very large pushback from charities and others, for good reason, that they were caught within the net, and I think they were rightly caught within the net. Unless we actually have a holistic regime, then people will set up vehicles, whether they be charities or third parties or the like, and we need to make sure that they are equally covered with appropriate caps, disclosure and the like. Otherwise, we'll just end up with the electoral fundraising and the fight moving from parties to third parties.
That's true. And the example that Senator McGrath raised was in relation to trade unions in Queensland specifically. And he indicated that registered third parties can spend just over $1 million centrally, then just over $90,000 in each electorate. So across all seats, that's almost $9.5 million each. But there are 26 registered trade unions in Queensland. So 26 times $9.5 million is a very significant spend that they are able to make. Parties are limited to 14.5 across all seats and centrally. So in very Queensland words, Senator McGrath would call that a financial gerrymander.
Yeah, and of course you can make the same point about a variety of other third parties as well. I mean, unions are a good example, and given their historical connection to one side of politics, they're one area you rightly focus on. Equally, you can point to some charities, you can point to corporations and the like. New South Wales sought to deal with this by reducing the caps on third parties, ran into problems in the High Court as a result. And I think this is one of actually the hardest areas when it comes to design, because and the job for this committee is, if you are to recommend change, is what do you see as a fair and appropriate cap, taking into account that we don't want to load it for one side of politics or the other. And there's no compelling or obvious answer to that. Again, I'd go back to the Centre for Public Integrity submission. I think it broadly sets out the expert approach that I would support. But I don't have the empirical evidence myself. I'm not enough of an expert to say it should be this dollar for unions or corporations or the like. I just don't have the background. I mean, Lindy may know more because she's looked at these issues in more detail than me.
I think, so I guess, to be honest, looking at these issues is actually what led me to the view of putting obligations in the news bargaining agreements around actually trying to have the points of distribution. So having media outlets as being the point at which we seek to provide the level playing field, because I think these third party issues are really difficult, and they're really difficult to cast in a way that people don't just move the money around, which is why I'd be a little bit inclined towards, which is why I'm inclined to actually target these folk that actually we haven't tended to think about in this space, with an obligation to provide equal voice to the different sides of the debate, to the different corners of the contest. And it would seem to me that the news bargaining code created an opportunity that perhaps wasn't there prior to last year, whereby, because that bargaining code was introduced to confer a range of benefits on a bunch of businesses because they're important to our democracy, it would seem reasonable for those businesses to then also have some obligations about fulfilling that role within democracy, and that particularly as we become concerned about political climates associated with people operating in echo chambers and bubbles. The idea that we have requirements that what are seen as the major media outlets are required to give different players equal voice. It's both. It seems to me to be both something we haven't had the opportunity to do before because they were not necessarily subject to something like that, and also it's also a pressing need that as we look at this issue of going, actually, it's a real challenge to democracy to be having people increasingly operating in echo chambers, that actually having media outlets having a requirement to say, look, if we're in an election context, you need to be providing space and voice for the different sides of the debate. To me, it seems like a neater way around the problem than trying to work out how on earth you regulate the third party issue.
Dr. Edwards, do you mean an equal voice or only voice? Is a political party or a political candidate able to purchase freely other forms of communication and advertising, or is your proposition a limit on that engagement?
So my proposition would be that the media outlets themselves could set the level, but the level of space that they were going to be making available for political advertising, but they would need to make the same amount of space available to the other major voices in the contest.
Isn't that a restriction on freedom of expression?
I must admit, I'm not sure on the legal, I don't know. George, have you got any thoughts on the legal requirements around that?
Well, if a private sector participant did it, they wouldn't be covered by the implied freedom of political communication, but they would be covered by the need to explain to their shareholders why they're not taking the advertising. That might be difficult for them. But I think, yes, I don't think you could regulate that, but I'm not sure you're suggesting that. That's where we ran into problems in 1992 in the Australian Capital Television case. So
that's right.
I think that would be a difficult area. And of course, in the end, the main game is turning to social media anyway. And it's not clear that even if we focused on the broadsheets, we would achieve the goal. So for me, that's why I focus more on the inputs through the money coming in and the total cap. And otherwise, I personally would not regulate the private sector and how it otherwise accepts this advertising.
I think there's a lot more to explore in this aspect of the discussion, frankly, but I also just wanted to flag one other thing, which I presume we don't have time to discuss today, Chair, but that is in all this discussion around political advertising, communications and things like that, we have not considered in any seriousness the sorts of scurrilous vilification that is levelled at often parliamentary members randomly across social media, which provides a platform for some of the more extreme levels of abuse that I've seen in a career of over 2.5 decades in politics now, and which I certainly have ongoing concerns about. And how you manage and deal with that, if you want to talk about truth in political advertising, let alone truth in those sorts of attacks, then that is a whole other story. But I recognise that particular Pandora's box is probably not best opened now.
Senator, one quick response to that, and this is one of the reasons this inquiry is actually urgent, because it looks like we're going to have a referendum next year on the voice, and what you were saying will be a very prominent and large part of that. And we've never had a referendum involving social media before, and unless in fact we get some recommendations and fix the Electoral Act for that referendum, there are actually I have grave concerns about what you are seeing will actually be in spades worse for a referendum dealing with racial issues and the like. It could be very, very problematic.
All right, well, thank you to both of you for your time and your submissions today. If the committee has any further questions, they'll be put to you in writing, but we very much appreciate you appearing today. You'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. And we will just allow for changeover. I think we've got some people online for the next session and some people in person, so we'll give that a moment. think we don't have maybe everyone online yet, but we might kick off anyway if we can. So perhaps if I start in the room and ask those of you present in the room for the Hansard record, can you state your full names and the capacity in which you are appearing before the committee?
Marion Saw, here for the Democratic Audit of Australia.
Michael Maley, here for the Democratic Audit of Australia.
Alice Giroux for the Human Rights Law Centre.
Thank you. And same online, if you could give us your full names and the capacity in which you appear before the committee.
Anthony Wheely, Chair of the Centre for Public Integrity.
Max Douglas, Researcher at the Centre for Public Integrity.
Thank you. Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I think we agreed that there would be no opening statements if you're all comfortable with that, given time and we want to get to questions and let you all speak. So I'll hand over to Senator Grogan.
Thank you. I wonder if you could give me a sense of how you think third parties should be treated under a reformed system. So the submissions that we have from you talk a lot about the caps, and previous commentary by those of you who haven't actually submitted yet talk a lot about donation caps and such like. The issue of third parties in this arena has been brought up a few times. Be keen to understand your perspective on how you think third parties should be regulated within a reformed system.
Well, we at the Democratic Audit have always argued that third parties should be covered by caps on donations and campaign expenditure. I believe that, you know, there's evidence now from the state jurisdictions, particularly New South Wales, which could be drawn on in thinking about how to deal with third parties at the federal level. But Alice may wish to expand on this.
Thanks, Marion. We take a different position, and just for a bit of context, at the Human Rights Law Centre, we've been consulting with many different stakeholders on exactly this question for about 5 years. And where we've landed is, so there's lots of different types of third parties, of course, and we've tried to take each into account. When it comes to spending caps, third parties should absolutely be captured. We think that spending caps is actually the only equitable way of really regulating third parties in the same way. When it comes to donation caps, we don't believe third parties should be captured. And a really important reason for that is when you consider which third parties receive donations in the first place, you're looking at community groups, not-for-profits, charities. You're not looking at big industry associations, corporations. So what introducing donation caps actually means is a big discriminatory impact on some third parties, particularly community voices. A lot of charities are already by law prohibited from supporting or opposing political parties, whereas you're not regulating corporates or industry groups at all. So we strongly believe that the Queensland model is the best model in that regard. And when it comes to transparency, there are some measures that absolutely should apply to third parties. For instance, lowering the disclosure cap. We believe it should be at $2,500. That's much easier for charities to comply with. It will mean that there's a much more vibrant...
Can I just clarify, is that the disclosure cap for third parties?
That's right.
Not across the board?
We would say $2,500 meets the needs across the board. We know that there's a push to $1,000. We don't think there's a huge difference between the two, but there's a big difference for third parties. So at the very least, we say $2,500 for third parties. And the last difference in terms of treating third parties is we say real-time disclosure is a huge barrier to charities engaging in political advocacy. The reason being, sorry, I'll stop after this, but the definitions of electoral expenditure and electoral matter under the Commonwealth Electoral Act are incredibly complicated. And charities frequently need to go out and get legal advice in terms of whether or not they need to disclose under those provisions. If they have to do that in real time, and if they have to pay for legal advice in real time, the outcome will absolutely be that charities will self-silence. We're already seeing that under this regulation. And in the context where, you know, lots of third parties don't pose the same corruption risk as political parties and candidates. So they're the sort of, that's where we've landed in terms of concrete recommendations.
So would you see a system that would have a set of rules that recognised the circumstance of those third parties separate to other forms of donation? So actually creating creating different rules for that particular category?
Yeah, that's right. So there'd be, and only insofar as is necessary, but there would be a difference in treatment between political parties and third parties. I mean, they operate differently, so we think that that's reasonable.
And then leaving other sort of corporate entities just to be caught under disclosure?
So corporate entities would be caught under disclosure, of course, if they're giving to political parties. If they reach the threshold of being a significant third party, they'd have to disclose a lot of their income. But really, we think the key to regulating corporate influence in politics is through spending caps.
Okay, thank you. And our online participants, did you have any perspective that you'd want to share with us on third parties?
Well, we've given you a submission, I think, in relation to what I would describe as the need for third-party expenditure caps. And we're very cautious in this submission because of the constitutional law requirements. But we do believe there should be a cap on third-party electoral expenditure, and also a requirement to register with the AEC when a third party intends to exceed or has exceeded such an amount. The reason why we're cautious, I've mentioned briefly, but we do believe that any third party cap and associated registration threshold requirement would need to be determined by an inquiry by suitably qualified people appointed by the Parliament. And again, that's because of High Court rulings, which have made it clear that you can't just pluck these figures out of the air. There has to be a strong evidential basis for them. I'll just ask our researcher, Max Douglas, if you wouldn't mind just developing that last point as to the quantum issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I have particularly much to add. I think we largely agree with Alice in that when we consider talking about third parties, this isn't some kind of homogenous group, right? Large corporations and community organisations are obviously very different in the way that they engage in politics, and that's where I think our registration requirement is something that is important. We really don't want to be, because I mean, we believe honestly that electoral expenditure and donations are actually important for democracy. I think often a lot of this discourse can get caught up in lumping large corporations in with small community groups, and that's where we think the registration requirement is important. We don't want to be placing an undue burden on these small community groups, and quite frankly, I think the health of our democracy depends on their donations and their electoral expenditure. So I think that's where our registration requirement tries to find that balance.
Great, thank you. And Ms. Jory, I wonder if you have any perspective on the issue of truth in political advertising that you'd want to share with us.
We do.
I figured you might.
Thank you for your question. We do, and look, we've ummed and ahed about this in honesty for a while, but we do think that we've come to a point now where regulation is required. We're deeply concerned that we're sort of heading down a dark path of huge amounts of disinformation. We're really worried about what's happening in the United States at the moment. Disinformation spreads all year round. It's not dependent on the electoral cycle. It's not just spread by, third parties and candidates and politicians. We think more holistic reform is absolutely needed, and we're really inspired by the Digital Services Act in the EU. Obviously, for the purposes of this committee, the question is much more limited, and we have fallen on the side of it's an important opportunity to take up to try and introduce so-called truth in political advertising laws, or we prefer to call it like a prohibition on misleading voters. South Australian model is decent, with some amendments to make it appropriate for federal level.
And as a proud South Australian, what sort of amendments do you think would be required to... I mean, I'm very used to that law in South Australia. We've been living with it for quite some time. How would you see any changes that might need to be made to make that applicable in a federal space?
Yeah, I think one of the ones that we've explored, so one of the limitations of the South Australian model is it applies to statements of fact. That's an important thing to retain as opposed to opinion. But there seems to be this kind of legally grey area where someone's doctored a photo, and so the one that comes to mind, and I noticed Mark Lawyers has submitted this and we had a conversation with them about it. For instance, the campaign against Pocock and Zali Steggall by Australia Remade, in terms of them revealing that they were wearing a Greens t-shirt. Mark Lawyers landed on the basis that wouldn't actually breach the South Australian laws if they were enforced at federal level, because it wasn't technically a statement of fact. We're really worried about things like that happening. It's certainly not the first time that's happened, but also deep fakes are going to very quickly become a reality of our election cycles. So that's kind of one, we think, important change. It might seem a bit niche, but actually quite important. I think there is and forgive me, this isn't actually in the submission, but there are other important sort of factors to take into account in terms of requiring people to give their how to vote cards to the regulator, I presume it was the Australian Electoral Commission, a week or two in advance of the election, so there's actually time to assess their factual accuracy ahead of the election, so you can't use these laws to be weaponised. You can't weaponise these laws against opponents by asking for an injunction to stop people from handing out how to vote cards on election day, which we know is quite common practice. I'm sure my colleagues have views on truth in political advertising as well. But.
And can I just note at this point, I think we have on the line Professor Coggill and Professor Sanford. Are you on the phone now? Maybe not. No, we'll try again on them. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, Professor Orr should be speaking to this, but I'm not sure where he is. Yes, we are very cognizant of the complexities of trying to deal with truth in political advertising, but also coming to the conclusion that really something needs to be done now, that it's misleading campaign advertising is really getting out of hand, and to add to what Alice said about the need to go beyond political statements to deal with the increasingly visual aspect of campaigning, we included in our submission the example of truth trucks showing Xi Jinping voting Labor, which was clearly a misleading piece of electoral matter, but did not involve a statement. I think that basically my view and Professor Orr's view, wherever he is that we should build on the South Australian experience, but that we do need to update some provisions which are in the South Australian legislation. But you might want to talk about some of the challenges, Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's worth bearing in mind that some of the history behind truth in advertising regulation. It actually goes back to the First World War, when the Hughes government brought in a regulation which purported to prohibit misleading statements of fact in relation to the conscription referendums in 1917. And this actually formed the basis for the provision which was briefly in the Commonwealth Electoral Act in 1984. I know that because I did the drafting instructions for those provisions. There are, I think, some administrative issues that really need to be thought through very carefully by the committee in relation to how this would be implemented in practice. And I'd say I would strongly support the view of the AEC that they should not be involved in this exercise. It's not something in which they have a developed skill at the moment, so they are not in that sense the obvious regulator. But I think the more important point is that, as was flagged in the earlier discussion, there's an awful lot hanging on public trust in our election administration bodies. And we see in other countries now the consequences of that trust falling away. If the AEC were to be involved, the latent objective of that would be to draw on the reserves of public trust in the AEC to give credibility to the process of administering the truth in advertising laws. The risk is that the flow would be the other way, and that the challenges of administering the laws would poison the public trust in the AEC. And here I just think it's worth bearing in mind some of the problematical elements. And if you look at the South Australian provision, for example, where it talks about statements, it is not confined to statements that one party might make about what the other party would do in government or what their policies may be. It talks about statements of fact. So you could well imagine circumstances where statements are made which someone might wish to dispute but which are not easy to fact check. Nuclear power is safe or is not safe, or is economical or is not economical. The government saved X number of lives by rolling out vaccines. Global warming is or is not really happening. These are all things that could potentially give rise to complaints by tendentious participants in a political process. Or the one I particularly like, the United Australia Party would be producing its third Prime Minister if Craig Kelly became Prime Minister. So these are statements which are easy to make and they're difficult to fact check. And if you have an environment where there is a plain prescription on blatantly untrue statements, it becomes more likely that the complaints, where they're made, are going to be focused on statements that have been deliberately put in a grey area that are intended to give an implication but are not perhaps literally false in the way that they're phrased. And those are precisely the sorts of situations where you put the administrator in a no-win situation, because one side will feel very strongly that they've been defamed or misrepresented. The other side will say, well, we chose our wording very carefully so as not to make a statement that was false, and no one winds up happy, and it damages the reputation of the regulator. So that, I think, is a very compelling reason why there should be either another body given that function other than the AEC, or a one-off body set up simply to deal with these issues. And if it turns out that it can't maintain its reputation in the face of all these challenges, no great damage is done to the broader political and electoral environment. I think it's probably worth making the point that a statement about what another party may do in government doesn't become false simply because that party denies the statement. There have been enough examples of parties which say one thing in opposition and do something else in government. So I suspect some of those purported things that parties view as misrepresentations or false statements about themselves really wouldn't fall into a category of falsehood that would stand up in court. So I think the practical implications of trying to bring some of these things under a legal framework do need to be borne in mind very clearly when the scheme is being devised.
Thank you.
All right, I'm just going to check. Do we have anyone on the phone line at the moment? No? No one's on the phone? Okay. Just if people can stay on mute then if they're not actively in the discussion. Senator Payne, did you have some questions you wanted to ask?
Thanks, Chair, and good afternoon to all of the witnesses. Thank you very much for your submissions and for your time. I wanted to ask some questions around political donation and expenditure reform. And I think almost all of those represented today have an interest in this, so I don't mind who responds. But given particularly the use and power of social media to run campaigns, lobbying campaigns, issues campaigns, I can see a lot of ways in which a campaign that's designed to influence voters could operate to work around expenditure caps, for example. So if a third party tries to run an issues campaign that's not captured by the cap as however it is designed, or potentially by the Electoral Act, how do you envisage that that we would deal with activities like that? And if you have third-party expenditure that has been previously suggested could be included in a party's cap, if it was seen to be supportive of that party's campaign, does that also look like a workaround of any potential
Hello, is there
reform?
a human being at the other end of this line?
Hello, you're on the, you're speaking in the inquiry. Who have we got there?
Sorry, it's Professor Graham Orr at the University of Queensland. I was told by the Secretariat to join by chorus call because WebEx is failing. And I'm sorry, when you did ask if there was someone on the line, I tried to make myself heard, but chorus call is now just giving me Muzak, so I can hear you. But
Graham, I was on the line, Spencer Zivchak speaking from the Accountability Roundtable, but I'm having exactly the same problem. WebEx is not working, so I'm on the teleconference. But,
I can hear Spencer and the chair, I think. But sorry, it's a bit snafu, but brave new world.
Oh, okay, so you're not hearing the people on the video link at the moment. Is that your problem? Right, I might ask the Secretariat to talk to both of you to sort that out. But sorry, I'll say we've got Professor Orr on telephone. Is that correct?
Yes, I can hear you now, and I heard Mr. Maley loud and clear, and then I think there were two women speaking, and that was a bit...
Professor Spencer Zivchak here, and I'm having exactly the same problem.
All right, I'll get the Secretary to look into that.
Sanford here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
I
Professor
had the
Sanford.
same problem for 10 minutes or so, but I'm now actually, by some miracle, actually on WebEx.
Okay, excellent. Okay, Professor Sanford, you say they're on WebEx. We'll try and sort out the issue for the people who are on the chorus call. Senator Payne, back to you for your questions.
Well, welcome the extra witnesses who are attending, but I think I've completed my questions, Chair. I'm just interested in responses to that.
Yeah, could I perhaps say that the Centre for Public Integrity is quite happy to try and answer some of those matters, and I'll perhaps ask our principal researcher, Max Douglas, to address directly the matters that have been put forward by.
Yeah, so I might talk first to your second question, Senator Payne. So most of the comparable expenditure caps regimes around Australia include what we would consider to be an anti-circumvention offence, in which it's an offence to act in concert with a political party or someone with an agenda to essentially circumvent your applicable expenditure cap. Our submission also recommends that associated entity spending should be, in fact, added on to political party spending. They should come essentially under the same cap. But we believe that the current Commonwealth definition of associated entity should be narrowed to entities that exist solely for the benefit of the relevant political party. But we do understand that with caps do come potential workarounds, and we believe the anti-circumvention offence would protect it from that.
For the entire period of a parliamentary term?
Sorry, could you repeat that, Senator Payne?
Yeah. Do you, Mr. Douglas, mean that that would apply for the entire period of a parliamentary term? So not just in relation to election campaign periods, however they are actually qualified and described, because obviously in Australia that's in the gift of a Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm. So we only believe that these should be relevant for the capped expenditure period, which we detail in our submission. So we believe, obviously, the Commonwealth doesn't have statutory election cycles. So we believe that the applicable cap should happen 2 years after the previous polling day, given that would give roughly 12 months of a capped expenditure period. So we believe that should happen for that capped expenditure period. We don't actually believe expenditure should be capped for the 2 years before, but if, for example, parties seek to start spending outside the capped expenditure period, then that is something we may have to consider.
Okay, I think we might look at that evidence a little further. And finally, Chair, if I can just go back to the question that has been asked of previous witnesses in relation to candidates who these days operate with corporate structures operating their finances, less so the traditional party models that we've seen over time. Do you think that how would you structure a scheme that ensures that those corporate structures provide the same sorts of levels of transparency on donations and disclosures in that context?
Sorry, was that question to me, Senator Payne?
Well, I think Mr. Whealy volunteered you, Mr. Douglas.
Oh, unfortunately, I cannot comment on that at the moment. I'm not too privy to the corporate structure of campaigns at the moment.
Well, perhaps there are other witnesses who are familiar with some of the campaigns run by independents who had a more corporate financial structure than a traditional party structure who might be able to comment on that. And I turned off my video because I think it was making the sound, I think it was mucking up the sound, so I turned off the video.
Professor Orr, is that you that we've got on the screen now, and would you like to answer this question? You'll need to unmute yourself.
Apologies, I have some experience, more experience than with WebEx about writing about party structures and campaign structures and organisations. It's a very good point you make, Senator Payne. It's important to have regulatory neutrality when it comes to caps, especially on actors. You could be talking, I know you haven't given any examples, but you might have been talking directly about everything from the Climate 2000 to GetUp's model to what trade unions do through to Mr. Palmer's sort of self-inseminating, as we say. So it is important to have that kind of neutrality. I mean, the definitions generally in these laws are neutral. It's not just about whether your organisation is a political party that is usually an unincorporated association traditionally. Those definitions make a difference when it comes to disclosure sometimes, and we have to be careful about that. But when it comes to expenditure, the question is, would the Electoral Commission or a court decide that this was electoral matter? And that's much easier to do, as Max almost suggested, during a limited campaign period. It becomes much harder to operationalise that test about what advocacy is electoral matter when you get further and further away from the silly season, so to speak. And obviously we have organisations like Mr. Palmer's, whether it's his company or whether it's his party, were starting to campaign last September to get a march on the other minor parties. It didn't buy him seats in Parliament, but it certainly bought him attention in the agenda and was unfair competition over the other sort of what we might call right-wing minor parties. So it's a good point you make, but I don't think it's an insuperable one, and it's one that's dealt with overseas because we don't, in terms of expenditure caps, just focus on parties and candidates. We focus on the expression of organisations and individuals for that matter, which is a question, obviously, if you think about Mr. Palmer, if you have donation limits, he can't self-inseminate his party, but he can spend a lot of money by mineralogy campaigning. And we don't want those kinds of waterbed effects by just regulating parties.
Thanks, Chair.
Thanks. Senator Waters, did you have questions?
I do. Thanks, Chair, and thank you very much to the bevy of witnesses who are joining us, and let's hope the tech can hold. Thank you to those who are helping us with that. We've started talking about spending caps, and I'm interested, given the number of state jurisdictions that employ them, is there a preferred model that witnesses think would be useful for the federal scheme of spending caps to be based upon? I'm interested in the sort of spending that you think should be covered by a cap. Should it be everything that a political party spends, or should it just be advertising? Should it include staff? What's the sort of range of in-kind donations, for example? The period for which the cap should apply, I think we've heard reference to 2 years from the last election, but if I've got that wrong, please correct me. And of course, the issue about how we treat third parties with the spending cap. Mr. Douglas made a reference earlier that I didn't quite follow. So if anyone wants to elaborate on that, I'd be deeply appreciative. Thank you.
Perhaps, Max, since the challenge has been thrown down to you, you'll take up the gauntlet.
I'm sure I can speak to that a bit. I think generally we would consider the New South Wales model to be one of the best. I think in terms of the way that they cap parties and their candidates, but I think the nature of these things is that the Commonwealth has the luxury of being able to pick and choose bits from different states. At the Centre for Public Integrity, we really like the South Australian model, which essentially has one pot of money in which parties and candidates plug in for that pot of money, which means that some candidates have a greater spending cap than others. We believe that is fairer. But as I said before, the Commonwealth has the luxury of being able to pick and choose, but generally New South Wales we would consider to be the best. In terms of what's captured, the current definition of electoral matter, I believe, only relates to spending for which the dominant purpose is, I believe, dominant purpose test. So it means it only has essentially the sole purpose of it is to influence a way in elector votes. And that was changed, I believe, in 2018 from a definition of something which is likely to influence a way elector votes. We believe it should be rebroadened. Obviously, there are some disclosure, there is some kind of a greater disclosure obligation on electoral expenditure if we do rebroaden the definition. But we believe that in order to capture third parties, we do need to rebroaden that to matters that are likely to affect an elector in the way that they cast their vote. And obviously they may have some implications for third parties. We do believe the Canadian definition of electoral expenditure for third parties also has some merit. That definition essentially means that it's spending on a position that a party or candidate has taken, which essentially allows parties and candidates to set the tone. And then if large third parties want to contest on that kind of field, then they will be incurring electoral expenditure. Do any of the other witnesses have anything they'd like to say?
Sorry, if I could just come in there.
We might go to Professor Sawyer, and I can see Professor Sanford, you got your hand up, so maybe Professor Sawyer and then Professor Sanford.
If I might jump in at the end as well.
And then Mr. Roux.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to say that, yes, we feel that New South Wales experience is a very valuable source, and including their High Court experience with campaign expenditure limits. But also, I think it would be very useful to look at the Canadian experience of campaign expenditure limits as they apply to third parties. So that's another, thing that might inform your deliberations and recommendations. But I just want to go back just for a minute to one of Senator Payne's earlier questions about social media, simply to say that, clearly. Advertising on social media can be captured by campaign expenditure limits. There's a lot that can't be captured, which is the way that citizen actors engage with campaigns through social media, through dissemination, through the kind of viral dissemination of messages and so on. I don't think that you're ever going to be able to capture that with campaign expenditure limits, because it's not paid for, it's not paid advertising, it's citizen actors getting involved, which we saw a lot of in the 2022 election.
Thank you. Professor Sanford?
Thank you very much. Our
Lost you.
vision of in-kind contributions.
You're just breaking up, unfortunately, Professor Sanford. Do you want to try turning...
There's one.
Sorry, Professor Sanford, we're not getting you clearly here.
So that's the...
He's not getting us either.
He's not hearing us either, no. Professor Sanford, do you want to try turning your video off? We're getting a not great feed from you, so perhaps if you try turning your video off and just talking, it might mean we get a better feed.
No, for settings. Yeah, after that now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. That speaker and microphone.
That's
Is that better?
That's sounding much better. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Do you want to try again?
Hello. WebEx. So I'll try and firstly, it is very important to look at in-kind contributions. We go through some of the various possible in-kind contributions that need to be looked at. The second thing, but when we do talk about in-kind contributions, we're very conscious of some in-kind contributions which are inappropriate, which is those that political staffers, or those, sorry, not political staff, those who have been employed as electoral officers being engaged in political activity, whether that's internal or cross-party political activity. The final thing is that we think that we're in favour of caps, but just the recent changes that we don't know how significant the changes in the last election were, but we shouldn't structure these laws on the basis of the assumption of always having just essentially two competitive parties, and that we should structure things so that they don't effectively freeze out new entrants. And that's something that's probably we're more conscious of now, obviously because of recent events. We don't know whether they're going to continue, or whether there'll be new kinds of challenges or new kinds of political organisations. But I think that we want to be very careful about not entrenching existing parties in any particular donation regime.
Thank you. Ms Drury, did you want to add on that?
I'll make it quick. Thank you. Just firstly on my colleagues from Centre for Public Integrity's suggestion that we broaden the definition of electoral matter to something similar to what it was before. Just a word of warning that provision was almost impossible to comply with as a third party. I myself wrote to the Electoral Commission asking how on earth I was supposed to assess whether or not something might influence voters in an election. There was no time period. When does an issue become an election issue? And my experience was that nobody had any sense or any guidance of what meaning to give to that law. So while the definitions of electoral matter and electoral expenditure are complicated and in some respects fairly narrow, they were agreed on after a long, arduous period of consultation, and it's taken a long time for people to get across them. So we're very reluctant to open that up again. In terms of models that we believe work, we think the Queensland model is the best. We think it's preferable to the New South Wales model, if for no other reason than the New South Wales laws have been under fairly consistent constitutional question. And there's a matter before the High Court currently calling another aspect of the New South Wales electoral laws into question. In terms of one standout thing about the Queensland laws is that they do, and I think it was the Centre for Public Integrity mentioned this as well, they do capture associated entity spending in the spending of political parties, which we think is very important. However, the current definition of associated entity would need to be changed under the Commonwealth Electoral Law, which we believe would be a good thing regardless. And just finally, in terms of what should be caught of political party spending, I think there is perhaps best practice would be to cap political party spending under different heads of spending. So it could be, digital media advertising, billboards, paid organisers, that sort of thing. That could all come under the cap. Not so much staff who might be doing administrative work. Thank you.
Can I just have a follow-up question? I don't want to cut Professor Orr off. I definitely want to hear his view also. But just in relation to understanding Ms Drury's position there, I'm not sure if you can hear me, there's an awful lot of feedback on WebEx here. Anyway, are you proposing, an overarching cap and then sub-caps by type of expenditure? Can I just seek to understand you on there? And then I'm going to hear Professor Orr.
Yeah, it's a good clarifying question. We did toy with the idea of a sub-cap purely for social media because small amounts of spending get so much further. But at this stage, we think it's And especially as campaigning is moving into the digital space, it's probably too soon to propose subcaps. So thank you for the clarifying question. No, we're at this stage proposing a single cap and disclosure under those sub-disclosure under those headings, so that will then facilitate better further regulation in the future. Thank you.
Professor Orr, did you have something you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. In terms of this committee's deliberations or the Parliament, it's very important when you set the amounts of the cap that you do so on the basis of a rational approach, because the High Court will look at that and okay it if it's done rationally, with some sort of objective. This is media markets, this is traditional spending, but it's some of the accountancy work you've got to do behind the scenes and then discuss publicly. In relation to models, also the United Kingdom, of course, has significant experience with this, in particular because its Electoral Commission focuses almost solely on election finance, doesn't run elections. And it's been very active and put out various position papers and clarifying regulatory documents. And there's the 2000 UK Act, which you can look at schedules and see definitions of what's covered. Can I finally, because Senator Waters did mention advertising as an example, this links into the truth in political advertising debate. What do we define by advertising? We used to have a relatively simple, we thought, understanding, but it was never that simple. I mean, handing out pamphlets in the street, letterboxing is advertising, but it doesn't involve significant expenditure. On the other hand, as Professor Sawyer said, you don't want to be drilling down to capture just someone who makes up a meme as an individual. So you need some kind of definition there if you were going to focus, if you're going to have an actionable definition of what types of expenditure is caught, but you want to have it fairly broad to cover coordinated campaigning designed to get messages out. So that's all I have to say about that. But there's a lot of design issues that we could, spend many, many days, hopefully not on WebEx, talking about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, is there any time for further questions or not?
We have time if you have another question.
Oh, yes, thank you. And I really appreciate everyone's input on that. And hopefully, Professor Orr, we do spend a lot of time designing that model, because I certainly think that democracy would benefit from having such a model. Can I ask now about politicised government advertising in the lead up to an election? The Grattan Institute found a couple of weeks ago that there was about $50 million of public money that's spent on politicised government ads in the lead up to an election. Can I have someone suggest a regulatory response to that?
Clearly, we do need some kind of independent vetting of government advertising campaigns. It's well known that these peak before federal elections, that they are a huge incumbency benefit for the party in government. And though there are guidelines, they're not actually complied with, and we instead see very emotive advertising about the wonderful things that whoever the current government is has done, which don't provide any information which is of real necessity for citizens. So, we need to have some independent oversight of government advertising, I believe, and it would be also beneficial to have the guidelines embedded in the statute, so that they were not so easily dodged.
I'll just jump in to say I thought the Grattan Institute's report was pretty perfect, actually, and we'd sort of toyed with different ways of regulating it, but I think their criteria in particular that they set out for when government advertising is justified was pretty irrefutable.
Professor Sanford, did you want to add on that?
Yes, this is actually the fourth parliamentary inquiry in which I've given evidence on this. Our actual submission, pages 6 and 7, goes into some of that. Erica Betts had a big go at me, but the committee completely agreed with my approach. Was that this is an important power that governments have. There is a risk of abuse, and both parties agree that major parties agree that the other major party has breached that trust, and the crossbenchers say that both parties have. So this is a universal thing. Here is a power. There's a risk of its abuse. Everybody agrees that that risk has materialised, and so we have to do something about it. The proposals that we put back in 2002, the first time we were invited to make a submission on this, was certainly having the guidelines and having an independent body which would be appointed by a bipartisan process would actually apply those criteria. And this was done to some extent by Joe Ludwig during the Rudd government. But the thing is, and I still see that there's an independent communications committee that's been reformed. But unfortunately, like quite a few of these supposedly independent bodies, it was appointed only by the government and includes as the chair a former political staffer, which is just absolutely boilerplate. Don't do it that way. The answer clearly is, and in fact, there were suggestions that you might ask the Ombudsman or the Audit Office to do it. We actually suggested not to put extra burdens on them, and to some extent it might actually be an extra incentive to actually have a party political appointee to such an independent position. So our view was that it could be that the members should committee, the Auditor General and another. There was one alternative, or else have an independent body which is appointed by a bipartisan process. The bipartisan appointment process, I think, is very important for a lot of integrity agencies. It is interesting enough, it was something that the National Party proposed in 1989 for both Commission and now called the Triple C. They actually legislated that it's good.
Sorry, Professor Sanford, we're just losing you again on the connection.
Key integrity agencies like... okay, my apologies. But as I say, we believe in an independent process. And one way is that there's a parliamentary committee. Queensland approach is that a parliamentary committee makes a recommendation. The recommendation for the official must be by a majority, and the majority must include both a member of the government and the member of the opposition. But there are other models which we've suggested for the NACC, and I think the independence is absolutely critical. To some extent, you can actually have, if you've got a genuine independent body enforcing it, then in that case, you don't have to go through and dot every I and cross every T, because the thing is there'll be dynamic interpretation by those who are independent and are seen to be independent. But if there's not genuine independence, then it's pointless having a review committee.
Professor Ord, did you want to contribute on that? You're on mute.
20 years ago, I too was slandered by Senator Betts, but maybe he had a point. This is before I gave a Senate lecture on this. You also don't want to tie government up in constraints. We saw that obviously in COVID, and the Grattan report makes note of that. So you don't want gridlock in relation to important public campaigns that are always going to have a dual element. There's always going to be a benefit for the government of saying, look, we are protecting you, or we're doing things in the public interest. The problem with, I'll give you an example from Queensland at the moment. Senator Waters, in your letterbox, you've probably received several pamphlets from your local Labor member. If you're in a Labor seat, I don't know. It'll say that the Queensland government is now...
I'm in a green seat.
All right. 70% clean energy. Now, what does energy mean then? You know, this is government advertising that's actually deliberately misusing the term energy because energy is not Queensland electricity. It includes petrol and so on. That's just a small example that links into truth and political advertising problems. I studied this for a long time and came up with an idea that simply you need caps on this. And that sounds silly, and Senator Bett said it was like treating the executive government, as if you had pocket money. But whatever campaigns the executive or a committee says it's worth doing is going to benefit the government, and people are going to complain about it. So, what we got was we had, when the government was doing good things in higher education, we had campaigns to tell students about the good things. We never had a campaign to tell them about the fees going up and so on. So someone is going to be selecting that, and it's always going to be the executive government. Some advertising agency is going to want to get the information across in ways that are attractive. That's the nature of the game. So I can only see that you could do what we do with caretaker advertising. So either, as Professor Sanford said, it has to be agreed by the opposition, which is just going to lead to gridlock, or you simply say that Parliament says every year this is the cap on the amount of spending, you go off and spend it, but you've got to come back to us if there's a public emergency and you've already spent your dough. And that's obviously the Senate's then involved in that.
Thank you, Mr. Maley. You had Mr. Maley wanted to make a contribution, so can we go to him and then back to you, Professor Sanford?
Yeah, just two very quick points. First, I would agree that legislation is essential. Guidelines are too easily ignored when the crunch comes. Secondly, if there's to be a standalone body set up to administer truth in advertising, it might well be also an appropriate standalone body to deal with these issues of government advertising and cover advertising in general under the one rubric. Taking Professor Orr's point about the difficulty of getting bipartisan agreement, one possible scheme you could have if certain advertising slipped through the cracks would be to say that if it's been determined independently to have been political in the sense of advantaging the government, its value should be offset against the public funding payment given to the parties.
Yes, can I just get back, just clarification. I had been suggesting that both government and opposition had to agree to the advertising, but to the membership of the independent committee. And the suggestion just made that, of course, that they might have a role in that if it's not going to be government, if it's clearly if it doesn't pass the test of the independent body, then I think the idea that go against the expenditure is not a bad one. But of course, the thing is, you'd want to make sure the full three, merely the last year. Otherwise, you'd have an awful lot of contentious government advertising done in the 13th month before the likely election. So, overall, I think that the idea of having an independent body is an important one, and it's often the thing is that you might not be able to agree on the outcome between the government and the opposition, but there's a really good chance that you might agree to somebody you can both equally trust.
All right, we might close down that excellent discussion there. Senator Cadell, did you have some questions you wanted to get in there?
Just a little one. Can I thank you all, but for the Centre of Public Integrity, what a great submission. I may disagree with some little things in there, but I thought it was a very well thought and presented submission, so well done. You have a broadening of the definition of donation to include things. Surely in a prescriptive way, there are people out there who will look for the loopholes when we are prescriptive about what's included. Shouldn't we take it includes all income with the exclusion of, be explicit on what's excluded from income rather than try and include what is included? Oh, sorry. No, mute, sorry.
My apologies. I think we began, by looking at the evils that presently exist, and I think they can be readily identified in the way we have. These things like, sponsorships, special dinners, special functions, meet and greet, and all these sort of things that aren't within the definition of donations and yet account for a lot of money each election cycle. Clearly need to be captured. I think that's why we did it. We wanted to sort of capture the very essence of the things that we see as necessary to be included, and the things which are really happening on the ground. There may be other things as well, The trouble about the definition you've put forward, I mean, it's a good one in one way, but it kind of doesn't have that deterrent effect, which is what we're looking for. We want people to know that this is included. This is what's included. You can't avoid the definition of donation by paying $10,000 to sit next to a very senior politician.
No. I'm with you 100% on the exclusion. I would just come up with a new way of income, category of income, affiliation or otherwise, it may not find its way into that definition.
There are many ways it can be done. We accept that.
I'd just jump in there. I think affiliation might be perhaps too broad, but I think there could be ways, because what we're trying to regulate here is any form of income that could reasonably lead to access or an expectation of access for the politician. So I think, we've too have struggled with this definition, not to make it too narrow to itemise different types of income, because you just create a new form of membership fee or something like that. But we don't want to get too far down an affiliation sort of situation necessarily either.
And I think we're going back, I think there's lots of great ways we can improve our electoral process. As I said, the anti-privatisation of our electoral laws from either side. But in your field, do you feel the last election, in your hearts, was stolen, was wrong, was corrupt, or any of these things?
Jump in there.
Well, I'm not a member of the Republican Party.
That's what I'm getting to. In the concept of wealth stuff, there's been lots of talk about America. I think we've got lots of differences between America and the financing of super PACs and that sort of things. Do we feel the Australian election just held was corrupt or wrong or stolen?
I think
no, I don't.
Oh, sorry.
You.
Well, I mean, the fact is that there's never been less public confidence in our political institutions, in our political parties, and governments. And although there's, a great deal of confidence in the Australian Electoral Commission and in the administration of elections in an honest way, a non-partisan and independent way, there's still all of that money, just thrashing around in our elections like.
No question on that. Did it corrupt the electoral process in your opinion?
I'm not sure just what you're saying about what you're asking about the process. I mean, in terms of the electoral process, it was obviously completely above board.
Was it a legitimate election as held currently in your view?
Well, I believe that the presence of so much money in our elections gives rise to distrust on the part of voters.
I accept that. You're not prepared to answer yes or no whether it was a legitimate election?
I don't think that's up to me.
Okay. As an opinion.
So another way of asking that question is, have we hit rock bottom?
Yeah, we haven't. No, we haven't hit that.
And gratefully we haven't hit rock bottom.
Yep.
But I very much agree with Marion's sentiment that these huge amounts of injections of donations and election spending at different times across a couple of decades now have corrupted our political system, not just in election times. They're kind of acutely what we're focusing on now, but it does have a corrupting influence across the electoral cycle. And it's most acutely from harmful industries like the tobacco industry, which has very much come up against the coalition government in the last term, as well as the gambling industry, fossil fuels. So the corruption is lasting, whether or not we say, have we hit rock bottom yet in elections?
I find it very... Oh, sorry.
I'd come at it from a slightly different angle. I'd say there is no way that our election was corrupt.
Okay.
And I'd say that from having worked on elections all around the world for much of the last 30 years. When you compare it with operations like the independence vote in East Timor in 1999, which was marred by shocking intimidation, when you look at some of the corruption that's been seen in elections in places like Kenya and Papua New Guinea, our elections are totally in a different category from that. However, I'd put it this way: when you look at the situation in the USA at the moment, part of the problem that they have reached is not appreciating where there are problems which need corrective action. And so they effectively have got themselves now into a situation they can't get out of because they were so convinced for so long that their elections were the best in the world when they weren't, and they've left issues unaddressed. So the fact that our elections are very good by international standards is not an argument for not seeking to improve them.
No, I will improve it.
Yes, I can see Professor Orr, and then we'll go to Professor Samford after that. You're on mute, Professor Orr.
Important to be clear about language here. I mean, obviously our elections aggregatively are very clean, but you can have corruption of the body politic. And I think Mr. Palmer being allowed to spend nearly $100 million 2 elections in a row corrupt aspects of not the fairness of the election as the counting of actual votes compared to Timor or the US, but it certainly affects the ideals that we have, that you should have a certain amount of political equality, good deliberation, if that's possible, and integrity. And we talk about the Electoral Commission and its role. Mr. Wheelie, QC, mentioned the idea of buying access through sponsorships and so on. It's very clear that under the current law, you can't, as a business, say that that's not a donation. You can only say that some hard-to-define proportion of that expenditure is actually an expense, a business expense. You're getting some kind of contribution for it, like the rubber chicken dinner. But we don't have an electoral commission set up to be a regulator at the moment. They're merely an administrator. They don't have the kinds of powers that the Federal Election Commission in the US has over money in politics, even when it's not gridlocked, or the UK Election Commission, or even the New Zealand Commission. So we could give the Electoral Commission, the trusted body, more power to issue guidelines, administrative style guidelines, and use a traditional regulatory pyramid instead of just having this act, which is almost never taken to the federal court system, an act that stands there but is kind of honoured sometimes in the breach, and we don't have much enforcement because the federal police just says, oh, it's 2 years down the track now and we're not going to prosecute because our policies say we don't prosecute. We have a sort of a system that looks good on paper, but in some respects needs a regulator to help just give the kind of guidance that even small political parties will sometimes value, as well as to catch the bad men and women when they try and stretch the law and break it.
And then my next point is, I went through... Oh, sorry.
I was just going to respond that I think it asking, is our electoral system corrupt or is the election corrupt, is actually asking the wrong question with respect. And that's something in the exchange that I referred to in our submission. The thing is there a risk? Because the thing is that if you're a corporate board and you are considering potential challenges, think of problems, you've got to look at the severity of the problem and the risk. You act on the risk. You don't wait for the risk to materialise. And I think the things I'd say in all these things that you look to other jurisdictions to see where problems have emerged, even where they haven't emerged in Australia. And you also sort of think, well, if I was the bad man, if I was trying to corrupt this process, what would I do? Are there opportunities? And I actually think there's a lot to be said in any regulation, when you do the regulatory pyramid or anything like that, is to say, how might this be corrupted by those of an eagle mind? And so I think that it's, where I expect things, I do think our electoral system is very good comparatively internationally, partly because Australia has been global leaders in some really important electoral reforms, going back to secret ballot and so forth. But I think what we have to do is continually try to improve the system and recognise where the weaknesses are and there's a risk. And so we act on the risk, not on the actual corruption.
I'm happy with that. Now, my next point is we continue, I spoke to some witnesses earlier, we continue to point out Clive Palmer UAP funding as a big risk. The great thing about Clive Palmer UAP funding is we know it was Clive Palmer UAP funding. We know where it has come from. It was disclosed by almost by its definition. Can anyone tell me, other than Simon Holmes at court via Twitter, by the corporate structure, who were the significant donors to the Teal movement And we don't know that, do we? I've heard rumours, I've heard ex-Prime Ministers of the persuasion of the blue colour might have contributed to those funds. I've heard a name of an American gentleman who's come to Australia, I'll just try and find his name, Chris Barker. I've heard these things, but no one knows because of the structure we've got. And that is potentially a bigger fear than the Palmer money.
It's a strong point in favour of more regular real-time disclosure that applies across the political party lines, I think. Yeah.
But it wouldn't do so because it was a corporate structure. It was a different way of method. It was put through a Climate 200 other body.
So by corporate structure, we're talking about like the pooling, so it goes to
another body,
yep. And then from that body, so if we had donation caps, that structure would actually be very difficult. So I think many of the people appearing before the committee are quite strong advocates for donation caps. But I think there are also ways of, I think depends now if Climate 200 ends up being an associated entity, but Climate 200 is not that different to associated entities, and the reason why those that category was introduced in the first place is because associated entities were being used then deliberately to wash money. And so the way to do that is just to make sure that money coming into Climate 200 or any other donor body of that type also has to disclose their income.
Okay.
Right, I might ask one question before we reach our end, which still on this topic around donation and spending and funding reforms. Is there an element where we should be looking at an administrative burden that comes with that, and whether there needs to be public funding both for the AEC and for political actors to compensate for that?
I mean, I think some administrative funding is quite justifiable, as, you know, done at the state level, New South Wales and Victoria, but you have to be terribly careful that you don't increase incumbency advantage, that you do make provision for parties that don't have elected members, which, you know, is being done on a very small scale at the state level. But I mean, I think that has to be thought about quite hard.
Mr. Maley, did you want to add to that, or?
I actually had a different point I wanted to raise.
Okay, we might come back to you then. Ms. Drury, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just say I'm a strong advocate for more funding and for people to get the funding they need to comply with the administrative burden. Definitely agree that we need to be careful it's not at the level that it further sort of distorts in favour of incumbency. I'll also note, though, that the folks that find it hardest to comply with these laws and actually have to interpret some of the hardest definitions in the laws won't get public funding, and they are the third parties. So it's just kind of another reminder if the committee is thinking about the administrative burden of these laws to, you know, again, be very mindful of how we capture third parties.
Thank you. Professor Sanford?
There's one suggestion. We make it as an alternate suggestion, but as a long-term friend of mine who's followed politics for a long time, suggested that one way to handle this would be if all donations went through a public body. So you know, it would be sent out to whoever you want, but it'd be a way of actually recording all the donations and where they went to, and the thing is that you couldn't make a donation other than through that body, and that actually handles the administration issues. We haven't gone so far as advocating it, especially with Graham shaking his head, but it's something I think to seriously think about as a model of how the thing is that sometimes you have a law to say this is what you can do and this is what you can't do. Sometimes you have a mechanism, administrative mechanism, so that you can only do the right thing, because the thing is that the money will only get through to the intended beneficiary if, in fact, it's paid through that and declared. And it might be cheaper than paying for the parties to do the administration, and you might trust it more. Anyway, it's just a thought, and it's one more. It's also an indication there are different models. Sometimes you have a law, sometimes you have an administrative process by which the thing is that the law cannot actually be broken.
I'd like to say something too, if I could.
Yes.
Just on the public funding point, I wanted to, I'm happy to say that Max Douglas has written this part of our submission, and I wanted to finish up with Max making a comment in answer to the question that's been asked on public funding and support for the AEC. Max, if you didn't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably first like to talk to administrative funding for parties. So I think someone mentioned before that this gets caught up in incumbency advantage. I think the beauty of administrative funding, at least in New South Wales, is that funding is given out on a per member basis. So it's not just parties that inhabit the executive receiving public funds. It's all parties by virtue of being in Parliament receiving these administrative funds. And obviously a lot of these schemes in New South Wales and Victoria, there's no ability to profit from them. They're used for verified administrative expenses. And we believe that administrative funding is a potentially great way of getting parties off of potentially corrupting donations from year to year. I mean, currently the public funding system merely at the moment reimburses electoral expenditure, but we believe that there's room to support parties year round in recognition of their important contributions to kind of participation as well as representation within the community. So we believe we should support parties in this administrative capacity. I think the question then is, how do we support new parties that don't have representation in Parliament and aren't entitled to these administrative funds? We'd probably point towards the New South Wales New Parties Fund as a potential model, but we do recognise that there is a requirement and indeed a need to be able to support the administrative administrative burden on small parties, particularly, as I think Alice pointed out, given they don't have great compliance infrastructure.
All right. Thank you all so much for your time today. We really do appreciate all the effort you put into submissions and to being here and bearing with WebEx and telephone lines. It's a great benefit to the committee. If the committee has any further questions, they'll be put to you in writing and you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and you'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
And we're going to suspend the public hearing there. I'll ask committee members to stay if they can while we clear the room and a member has an issue they want to raise before we get to our next submitter. I will resume.
Here, Chair.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator Payne. Senator Waters is online and Senator Grogan and I are in the room. So we'll resume. And we welcome Ms. Given. Ms. Given, for the Hansard record, could you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? You're just on mute, Ms. Given.
Fiona Given, and I am a client of Remedy Australia.
Thank you. Although the committee doesn't require you to give evidence under oath, I should advise you that this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament and therefore has the same standing as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. I now invite you to make a brief opening statement before we proceed to discussion.
Thank you for inviting me to give evidence to you today. I am speaking to you from Camaragal country. The right to a secret ballot is a fundamental human right. However, I have never had this right due to my physical disability. I have always needed someone to assist me to fill out the ballot paper. When I made a communication to committee on the rights of persons with disabilities, they found that this was in breach of Article 29 of the Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities. What I am asking you to do today is recommend that the federal government investigates secure electronic voting methods. It is not appropriate that I have to share my voting preferences with my parents or my support workers. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Waters, I know you were particularly keen to ask some questions, so please.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thanks very much, Ms Gibbon, for joining us today and for your courage in taking the human rights case that you took and won. So congratulations for that. I hope that we have a chance to address some of the issues that that case has raised. And so with that in mind, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Your submission talks about the importance of accessibility and recommends co-designing voting methods, minimum standards for polling places and supporting materials for affected communities. What are some of the key methods that you think should be explored, and how do you envisage the co-design process working?
As I mentioned in opening, it is imperative that a secure electronic voting system is developed in consultation with both people with disabilities and cybersecurity experts.
Thanks, Ms Gibbon. You've referred to VSAP programs, and pardon my ignorance for not knowing the acronym there, but can you tell us a little bit more about how offline electronic ballots work and how they would improve accessibility and security?
Can I please take that question on notice?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Ms. Given. Can I ask now, in your submission, you mentioned that iVote and telephone voting doesn't meet relevant international requirements under the Convention on the Rights of People with a Disability, particularly in relation to security and privacy. Firstly, how do we make sure that we are actually upholding that convention and giving the appropriate and fulsome recognition and enfranchisement to people with a disability? But also, do you have any concerns that the recent COVID telephone voting provisions might also have had that, discriminatory, but also those impacts on security and privacy for people with disability?
Telephone voting is not private and you have no way of ensuring your vote is recorded correctly. Can I please take the rest of your question on notice?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much, Ms. Given. I have to give my apologies now for family reasons, but I'll leave you in the capable hands of the rest of the committee and the chair. Thanks to the Secretariat today.
Thanks, Senator Waters. Ms. Given, when you're talking about a secure private voting mechanism, I think from your submission, you're mainly talking about being able to do this sort of voting in person, so not using electronic or telephone sources. I'm interested, obviously in the last election, we used a lot of telephone voting because of COVID and there was a safety reason for that. Is there still a place in circumstances like that for telephone and online voting where we might need to keep people safe for reasons like COVID or others?
In my personal circumstances, I have actually had to become a silent elector, and that would be another prime example.
Okay. Perhaps could you, it's in your submission, but if I could ask you to explain for the committee the impact that not being able to have what you feel is a private and secure vote has on you, and why you think it's important that you have that access.
Firstly, it is a fundamental human right, and it is necessary to ensure my ongoing relationships are protected.
Thank you, Ms Given. And one other issue I'll raise with you, we heard from, I think it was Professor Williams earlier in the day around the provision in the Electoral Act around people, which disqualifies people with unsound mind from voting, and a suggestion that we should update that particular provision. Do you have a view on that?
I personally think it should be updated.
Thank you. Senator Grogan?
Thank you, Ms Given. I'm keen to understand if there are particular countries that you think that we should look to for any guidance or any progress that they may have made that could assist to inform or influence what we may look at here.
Can I please take that on notice?
Absolutely, that would be great. If you could provide us that guidance, it'd be really helpful. Thank you very much. That's the only question I had.
Thank you, Senator Cadell.
I didn't have an opportunity to read the submission for, so I might give a question on notice afterwards once I read it. Because I'm interested in was given the relationship between New South Wales iVote. I know it's not as great or some solutions, but I'll get on notice.
All right. Senator Payne, did you have any questions?
Thanks, Chair. And if I may, Ms. Given, thank you very much for your attendance today, and thank you for the submission from Remedy Australia. In terms of the previous question about international examples which you've taken on notice, I had a similar interest and would add to that whether there are any particular legislative approaches that you think have, or Remedy Australia think, have effectively addressed the issues that you raise. I take the points that you're making today very seriously. We've actually very briefly discussed telephone voting at this last election, particularly in relation to COVID, as a committee with the Australian Electoral Commission already. So your perspective on those international examples would be helpful. Can I also ask, and you may wish to take this on notice as well, can I also ask in terms of advocacy groups in Australia for people with disability? I'm well acquainted with Carolyn Fromeder from Women with Disabilities Australian and a very big supporter of their work and her work. I wonder whether also this is an issue which has been taken up more broadly, because to be honest, it is the first time it's been raised with me in an inquiry such as this. Thank you.
My understanding is that has been raised, but would have to take it on notice for specifics.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair. I might just, if I can indulge briefly, ask one more question on notice. It seems to me that for young Australians with disabilities who are wanting to cast their first vote, that this challenge that you've identified does present a significant barrier for them, which overlays the opportunity of casting their first vote as well. And so if you or Remedy Australia, Ms. Given, had anything you wished to add on that, particularly in relation to 18-year-olds coming onto the electoral roll and casting their first vote, I'd be very pleased to hear that on notice as well. Thanks, Chair.
It is a rite of passage.
It absolutely is. Thank you, Ms. Given. Are there any further questions? Thank you. We very much appreciate your attendance here today, Ms. Given. The committee's indicated there will be some further questions for you put in writing, and you have the questions on notice as well, and they'll be put to you in writing. And you'll be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and you'll have the opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And we will end hearings for today and be back tomorrow.
Thanks, Chair.
Thank you all.